Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
In the days when the world was yet young, and the light of the two trees lingered still in the memory of stone, there stood upon the borders of Ithilien a tower of such surpassing beauty that even the Eldar would pause in their wanderings to gaze upon its white walls. Minas Ithil it was called in those fair days, the Tower of the Rising Moon, and its silver light fell like gentle rain upon the gardens of Gondor, blessing the nights with radiance pure and cold. Yet in the deep places of the earth, where neither star nor moon could pierce the ancient darkness, there stirred a malice older than the kingdoms of men. For Sauron, the deceiver, he who had walked in fair form among the elven smiths of a region, had not perished with the breaking of his fair body in the drowning of Númenor. His spirit, diminished yet unbroken, had crept back to the shadows of Mordor, like some wounded beast returning to its lair. In those years of watchful peace, when the white tower of Minas Tirith gleamed across the waters of Anduin and the stewards of Gondor kept their ancient vigil, few marked the subtle changes that crept across the land. The roses of Ithilien bloomed as they had always bloomed, their petals pale in the moonlight. The nightingales sang their silver songs from bower and dell. Yet slowly, as the turning of the seasons, a shadow began to fall upon the fairest province of the South Kingdom. Isildur's bane lay hidden still beneath the waters of Anduin. Lost to the knowledge of men and elves alike, its golden fire dimmed but not extinguished. The Dark Lord knew not where his precious ring had fallen, yet he felt its presence in the world like a constant ache, a wound that would not heal. And so, in his hatred and his need, he turned his mind to other devices, other means by which he might extend his dominion over Middle-earth. The Nazgûl came first, though none called them by that name in those days. They appeared as kings and sorcerers, learned men who spoke of forgotten lore and ancient wisdom. To the court of Minas Tirith they came, and to the high halls of the Eldar, offering gifts of knowledge and tokens of friendship. Their faces were fair to look upon, for the shadow had not yet claimed them wholly, and their words were honeyed with the wisdom of ages. Yet Elrond half-elven, master of Rivendell, looked upon these strangers with growing unease. In the depths of his memory, earned through long ages of watching and waiting, he glimpsed something that made his heart grow cold. For he had stood upon the slopes of Mount Doom when the ring was cut from Sauron's hand, and he had seen the Dark Lord's form crumble into shadow and flame. The echo of that ancient malice now sensed in these fair-seeming lords, like the scent of burning carried on a summer wind. "There is a poison in their words," he said to Círdan the shipwright, as they walked together in the gardens of Rivendell, beneath the light of Gillistel. "They speak of friendship, yet I hear in their voices the whisper of the void. They offer knowledge, yet what they truly seek is dominion." Círdan, eldest of all the Eldar save Thranduil in his distant halls, nodded slowly. His grey eyes, which had looked upon the light of Valinor ere the sun and moon were made, held depths of sorrow that few could fathom. "The shadow grows again in the east," he said softly. "I have felt it in the turning of the tides, in the crying of the gulls. The ships that sail from the grey havens carry now a burden of unease, as though the very sea knows that darkness stirs once more. In Gondor, the warnings of the Eldar were heard with courtesy, but little heed. The men of the South Kingdom were proud in those days, secure in their strength and the memory of their victory. Had not Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand? Had not the Dark Lord been utterly defeated, his fortress of Barad-dûr cast down stone from stone? What need had they to fear shadows and whispers? when the white tree bloomed in the court of the kings and the palantir of Minas. Tirith showed them far and wide across their domain. Yet in the tower of the rising moon, strange dreams began to trouble the sleep of its guardians. They saw in vision a great fire consuming the white walls, turning silver to sickly green, and fair gardens to wastelands stark and bare. They heard in their dreams the sound of hammers ringing in caverns deep below the earth, and the chanting of voices that spoke in tongues both harsh and fell. The captain of Minas Ithil in those days was Ernur, son of Ernil, a lord both wise and valiant, who would in later days be king. To him came the dreams most clearly, and he alone among the guardians of the tower began to understand their import. For in the visions that haunted his sleep, he saw not the past, but the future, the slow corruption of all that he held dear, the transformation of beauty into nightmare, of hope into despair. Something stirs in the darkness beyond the Isildur, he said to his most trusted captains as they stood upon the highest balcony of the tower, looking eastward toward the mountains of shadow. I feel it in my bones, like the ache that comes before a storm. The enemy has not forgotten us, though we have grown comfortable in our forgetting of him. The wind from the east carried with it a scent that was neither flower nor earth, but something else, something that spoke of furnaces burning in the deep places, of metal being shaped by hands that had never known the touch of sunlight. In the distance, beyond the jagged peaks of the Isildur, a red glow began to flicker against the belly of the clouds, so faint that only the keenest eyes could mark it. Thus began the shadow's return to Middle-earth, not with war or conquest, but with whispers and dreams, with fair words spoken by fair faces that hid hearts of malice. The foundation of future darkness was being laid in those quiet years, stone by stone, word by word, until the very air seemed to thicken with approaching doom, and in the deep places where Sauron brooded in his diminished form, plans were taking shape that would shake the foundations of the world. The malin trees of Lothlorien had stood sentinel since the elder days, their golden leaves catching starlight like fragments of the ancient music that shaped the world. Yet in the season when the Eldar call Ivaneth, when the leaves should have sung with autumn's gentle voice, there came instead a silence that pressed upon the heart like the weight of unshed tears. Galadriel, Lady of the Golden Wood, felt the change as one might feel the first touch of fever in the blood. She stood upon the flet of Caras Galadon, her white raiment stirring in the evening wind, while below her the mirror pools reflected not the light of Erendil's star, but images that flickered and shifted like flames in a troubled dream. Her husband Celeborn stood beside her, his silver hair flowing like water in moonlight, yet even his presence could not ease the growing shadow in her heart. "The trees speak of corruption," she said, her voice carrying the music of streams over stone, yet touched now with a discord that had not been there in the golden years. From the borders of the greenwood to the eaves of Fangorn, the whisper passes from root to root, from leaf to leaf. Something walks that should not walk. Something builds that should not be built. Celeborn's grey eyes, which had looked upon the light of the two trees in Valinor, darkened with memory and foreboding. "I have felt it too, beloved, in the turning of the seasons, in the flight of birds southward bound. They flee not winter's coming, but something far more fell. The very earth grows uneasy beneath our feet. In the woods of Ithilien, where the roses of Gondor bloom fairest, and the streams ran clear as crystal, a gardener named Ioreth tended the groves that bordered the river Morgul. She was daughter to a long line of earth friends, those who could read the language of growing things as others read the runes of Numenor. Her hands were gentle with seedling and ancient oak alike, and the flowers turned their faces toward her as they might toward the sun. Yet on this evening, as the shadows lengthened and the first stars kindled in the darkening sky, she felt a tremor in the soil that spoke not of earthquake or flood, but of something far more sinister. The roses, which should have been preparing for their winter sleep, writhed upon their stems as though in pain. The ancient oak that stood beside her cottage, which had weathered storms beyond counting, creaked and groaned as though some invisible hand were twisting its trunk. "What ails thee, old friend?" she whispered, pressing her palm against the rough bark. Through the contact came images that made her heart race with terror. Deep caverns carved from living rock, forges burning with unholy fire, and shapes that moved in the darkness. Shapes that had once been men but were men no longer. The very roots of the trees were recoiling from something that approached from beneath the earth. Far below, in passages that had been delved in ages past and long forgotten, footsteps echoed in the darkness. Not the measured tread of men or the light step of wolves, but something else. Something that walked with purpose, yet brought with it the chill of the grave. In Minas Tirith, Denethor the steward stood in his chamber high in the citadel, gazing into the palantir of the South Kingdom. The Seeing Stone, one of the 7 gifts of Numenor that had survived the downfall, showed him visions that filled his proud heart with unease. He saw the borders of his realm, the fair province of Ithilien, where the flowers bloomed eternal and the waters ran sweet and clear. Yet overlaying this fair sight was another image, ghostly and terrible. The same lands transformed into waste and shadow. The flowers withered to ash, the streams running black as pitch. "My lord," came a voice from behind him. It was Hurin the Tall, warden of the keys, who had served the steward since the days of Denethor's father. The guards report strange tidings from the eastern borders. Merchants speak of lights seen in the Ithil Duath, where no lights should be, and of sounds carried on the wind, the ring of hammers and the chanting of many voices. Denethor turned from the palantir, his noble face etched with lines of care that had not been there in the spring. "What news from Minas Ithil? Does Enur send word of these disturbances?" "Nay, my lord. No word has come from the Tower of the Moon for 7 days past. The last messenger spoke of strange dreams that troubled the garrison and of a malady that had fallen upon the gardens, the flowers growing pale and sickly, though the soil was rich and the season fair. In the deep places beneath the Ithil Duath, where neither sun nor moon had ever shone, the whispers grew to murmurs and the murmurs to a dull roar of industry. Ancient tunnels, carved in the elder days by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm in their eastern wanderings, now echoed with the sound of picks and hammers wielded by hands that knew no weariness. The Nazgûl, 9 lords of men who had accepted rings of power from the deceiver's hand, labored not with their own strength, but with the will of their master, directing the work of countless orcs and trolls, and darker things that shunned the light. The foundation they laid was not of stone alone, though mountains of black granite were quarried from the depths and hauled by chains to the building place. It was a foundation of malice and despair, of ancient grudges given form and substance. Each stone was set in place with curses in the black speech, each timber hewn from trees that had been twisted by evil into shapes that hurt the eye to look upon. From Dol Guldur in the south of the Greenwood, where Sauron in diminished form had built a lesser stronghold, came the plans and patterns for the great work. The Dark Lord had learned much in his years of torment, and chief among his lessons was this, that fair things could be corrupted more easily than they could be destroyed, and that the corruption of beauty brought with it a despair more complete than any wrought by simple ruin. The whisper in the trees grew stronger with each passing night, carried from root to root across the leagues that lay between Lothlorien and the borders of Mordor. It spoke of ancient treaties broken, of trust betrayed, of the slow poison that turns love to hatred and hope to despair. The very stones of Minas Ithil began to sing a different song, their silver voices growing harsh and discordant, as though the materials of which they were made remembered older loyalties than those they had sworn to Gondor. And in her garden in Ithilien, Ioreth the flower tender wept, for she alone among mortals could hear what the trees were truly saying, that the time of fair beginnings was ending, and the age of shadow drawing nigh. Upon the great east road there came a rider in the grey hour before dawn, when the mists clung to the hollows like the breath of sleeping giants, and the world lay hushed beneath a veil of silver dew. His horse was grey as storm clouds, fleet of foot and strong of heart, and bore its master with a purpose that brooked no delay. The rider himself was tall and lean, wrapped in a cloak that seemed to shift between grey and blue as the light touched it, and leaning upon his saddle bow was a staff of ashwood, worn smooth by long years and many journeys. Gandalf the Grey, Mithrandir as the elves called him, Stormcrow to some who knew him less kindly, rode through the morning mist with trouble weighing heavy on his heart. Behind him lay Rivendell, where he had taken counsel with Elrond half-elven, and before him stretched the long road to Gondor, where darker news awaited his coming. Yet it was not to the White City that his path led him now, but to a place far more perilous, the borders of that fair land where shadow and light met in uneasy balance. 3 days past, in the house of Elrond, the eagle Gwaihir had brought tidings that turned the wizard's blood to ice. From his high eyrie in the misty mountains, the great bird had seen smoke rising where no smoke should rise, and lights burning in the deep places of the earth. More troubling still were the words he bore from Radagast the Brown, who dwelt in the borders of the greenwood and spoke with all the creatures of field and forest. "The very earth grows sick," Radagast had said, his message carried on the wind by thrush and starling, from wren to eagle's ear. "The trees speak of tunnels delved beneath their roots, of fires that burn without fuel, of voices chanting in tongues that freeze the sap in living wood. Something stirs in the deep places, Mithrandir, something that was not wholly destroyed when Barad-dûr fell. Now, as Shadowfax bore him eastward through the dawnlight, Gandalf felt the weight of those words like a stone in his breast. He had hoped, nay, he had believed, that Sauron's defeat upon the slopes of Mount Doom had ended the threat of the Dark Lord forever. The wise had spoken of it thus in council, that evil so great could not return in like form, that the breaking of the Dark Lord's body had scattered his malice to the winds like smoke. Yet wisdom, as Gandalf had learned through long years of watching and wandering, could be the greatest folly when it closed the heart to darker truths. The ring had not been destroyed. This he knew, though he had not spoken of it even to Elrond. Isildur's failure upon the slopes of Orodruin weighed heavy on the wizard's mind, for while the ring endured, its master could not be utterly unmade. The road began to rise as he entered the hills of Rudor, where ancient kings had once held sway, but now only the wind ruled over broken stones and grassland wild. Here Shadowfax slowed his pace, not from weariness, but from the growing unease that all beasts feel when shadow draws near. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, catching sounds that mortal hearing could not grasp, and his great head turned often toward the south, where the peaks of the Ephel Duath rose like a wall against the sky. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Gandalf came upon a sight that filled him with foreboding. In a dell beside the road, where a clear stream had run since the elder days, the water now flowed dark and sluggish, its surface filmed with an oily sheen that caught the light in unwholesome hues. The willows that had dipped their branches in the current for 1,000 years now stood leafless and brittle, their bark split and weeping a sap like black tears. The wizard dismounted and knelt beside the poisoned stream, touching the water with the tip of his staff. At once a vision came to him, clear and terrible. Deep caverns carved from living rock, where forges burned with flames that gave no warmth. and in the heart of those caverns a great work taking shape. Not a fortress or a tower, but something far more subtle and more fell. He saw the plans as though they were graven upon his mind. The slow corruption of Minas Ithil, the fairest of Gondor's towers, not by siege or storm, but by a poison that would seep into its very stones. He saw the gardens withering, the silver light growing dim and sickly green, the guardians falling one by one, not to sword or arrow, but to despair and madness. And beneath it all, in chambers delved far below the foundations, he glimpsed the source of the corruption. 9 figures in robes of black, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to swallow light itself. "The Nazgûl," he whispered, and at the speaking of that name, the very air seemed to thicken and grow cold. So it begins again. Shadowfax whinnied softly, a sound of warning and unease, for horses are keen to sense the presence of those who once were men, but are men no longer. Gandalf rose from beside the stream and looked long toward the south, where a darkness seemed to be gathering at the edge of sight. Not the clean darkness of night or storm, but something that devoured light and gave back only shadow. The way ahead led through the valley of the Minas Ithil, where the ruins of ancient towers stood sentinel over paths long abandoned. Here in ages past the Dunedain had kept watch against the wild men of the hills, but now their stones were broken and their halls given over to the wind. Yet as Gandalf rode among them, he felt eyes upon him, not the gaze of living watchers, but something colder and more fell. From the shadow of a fallen arch stepped a figure wrapped in grey, its face hidden beneath a deep hood. At first glance it might have been taken for a fellow traveller, a wanderer like Gandalf himself seeking passage through the wild lands. Yet Shadowfax reared in terror, his eyes rolling white, and the wizard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. "Well met, Mithrandir," the figure said, and its voice was like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "Long has it been since we spoke together in the halls of learning, you and I. Much has changed since those fair days in Eregion, when the world was young and hope burned bright in the hearts of the wise." Gandalf's hand tightened upon his staff, and a light began to gleam from its crystal head, not warm and golden as it was wont to shine, but cold and white as starlight. "I know you," he said, though the words came hard to his lips. "You who were once counted among the mighty, before you took the gift that was your doom. Why do you bar my path? You who once bore a name that was spoken with honor among both elves and men." The hooded figure laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the deep places of the earth. "Names are for the living, grey pilgrim. I am beyond such things now, as you shall be when you have learned the futility of hope. The work begins again in the east, and not all the wisdom of the Valar shall prevent its completion. The Tower of the Moon shall become the Tower of Dark Sorcery, and from its halls shall come such despair as will break the hearts of kings." "Not while I draw breath," Gandalf replied, and his staff blazed forth with sudden fire, driving back the shadows that pressed close about them. "Begone, Wraith. Return to your master and tell him that the wise are not yet sleeping. The light endures, though darkness gather, and there are those who will stand against the shadow while strength remains in their hearts." The Nazgûl hissed like steam escaping from a cauldron, and its form began to waver and fade. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it whispered as it dissolved into shadow and wind. "The foundation is laid, the work proceeds, and soon the fairest of towers shall become the most fell. Look to the east, Stormcrow, and despair." Then it was gone, and Gandalf stood alone among the ruins, with only the wind for company. Yet in that wind he heard an echo of malice, and in the shadows cast by the broken stones, he glimpsed shapes that should not be. The road to Gondor stretched before him, but now it seemed darker than before, fraught with perils he had not foreseen. With a heavy heart he mounted Shadowfax once more, and rode on toward the gathering storm. The path that led from the ruins of Mordor wound southward through valleys that had once known the laughter of children and the songs of harvest time, but now lay empty beneath the wheeling sky. Gandalf rode in silence through that desolate land, his grey cloak drawn close about him, for though the sun shone bright overhead, there was a chill in the air that spoke of winter coming early to the world. 3 days he travelled thus, taking little rest and less comfort, while Shadowfax bore him with the tireless pace that was the gift of the Mearas. The horse seemed to sense his master's urgency, and though his flanks grew lean and his coat lost its silver sheen, he pressed onward without complaint, his great heart beating steady as a drum in the gathering dusk. On the 4th day, as the sun sank low in the western sky and the shadows grew long upon the earth, Gandalf came to a place where the road forked like a serpent's tongue. One path led east toward the Dagorlad and the passes of the Ephel Dueth, while the other turned south through the borders of the Greenwood, where Thranduil's people dwelt in halls of stone and tree. It was this southern path that the wizard chose, though his heart misgave him at the taking of it. For ahead, rising like a cancer from the heart of the great forest, stood the hill that in the elder days had been fair to look upon, crowned with trees that sang in the wind and streams that laughed over stones bright as crystal. Amon Lanch it had been called then, the Naked Hill, though naked it was not, but clothed in beauty that even the Eldar praised. Yet now it bore a different name, one that was spoken only in whispers by those who knew its meaning. Dol Guldur, the hill of dark sorcery, where shadow had taken root and grown strong in the secret years. The forest itself seemed to recoil from that accursed place, where once the great trees had grown tall and proud, their branches reaching toward the light. Now they leaned away as though blown by some unfelt wind. Their leaves, which should have been green and gold in the autumn season, were brown and sickly, and many hung lifeless from branches that groaned under their own weight. The very air grew thick and oppressive as Gandalf drew near, and Shadowfax snorted in distress, his steps becoming uncertain upon the leaf-strewn path. From a ridge that overlooked the southern reaches of the wood, Gandalf looked upon Dol Guldur for the first time in long years, and what he saw filled his heart with dread. The hill still rose from the forest floor, like the knuckle of some buried giant, but its slopes were no longer green with living trees. Instead, a fortress of black stone crowned its summit, its towers twisting skyward like accusing fingers. No banners flew from its battlements, no lights shone in its windows, yet from its very stones there seemed to emanate a darkness that was more than the absence of light. Around the base of the hill, the forest had withered and died. Great trees that had stood since the elder days lay fallen and rotting, their trunks split and hollow, their roots thrust up from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. Where once clear streams had run, now only stagnant pools reflected the grey sky, their surfaces filmed with scum that glowed with an unhealthy phosphorescence in the gathering dusk. Yet it was not the fortress itself that filled Gandalf with the greatest foreboding, but the activity that surrounded it. Even from his distant vantage point, he could see the movement of countless dark figures among the ruins of the trees. They laboured without rest, these servants of the shadow, hauling great stones and timbers, delving trenches in the poisoned earth, raising walls and towers that hurt the eye to look upon. The sound of their toil came to him on the wind, the ring of hammers on anvils, the creak of great wheels, the chanting of voices in tongues that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the days of Morgoth's dominion. So, the wizard murmured to himself, his words barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the dying leaves. The necromancer has indeed returned to his fastness, and his power grows with each passing day. But what work is this that requires such haste, such industry in the deeps of night? As if in answer to his question, there came a sound from the hill that made his blood run cold. A great horn blown from the highest tower, its voice deep and mournful as the cry of some beast in mortal pain. At its sounding, all labor ceased for a moment, and in that silence Gandalf heard another sound that chilled him to the bone. The beating of great wings in the darkness above the hill. From the shadows that pooled around the base of Dol Guldur, there rose shapes that might once have been eagles, but were eagles no longer. Their feathers were black as midnight, their beaks curved like scimitars, and their eyes burned with a fire that was not of this world. 9 there were in all, and as they circled the hill with slow, deliberate wing beats, Gandalf knew them for what they were, the fell beast that would in time bear the Nazgûl through the skies, spreading terror in their wake. Upon the back of the greatest of these creatures sat a figure robed in black, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to swallow the very light. Even at this distance, Gandalf could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and malevolent as the touch of winter. This was no lesser servant of the Shadow, but one of the 9 themselves, perhaps their chief, the Witch King of Angmar, who had brought ruin to the North Kingdom in ages past. The rider raised one gauntleted hand, and from his fingers there streamed a light that was not light, but its very opposite. A darkness visible that writhed and coiled like living smoke. Where this unlight touched the dying trees, they crumbled to dust. Where it fell upon the stagnant pools, the water boiled and steamed, giving off vapors that reeked of corruption and decay. Then the fell beast wheeled in the air and flew toward the east, its great wings bearing it swiftly over the forest canopy. Gandalf watched it go with growing unease, for he knew that its destination could only be the fair province of Ithilien, where Minas Ithil stood bright and beautiful upon its hill, unconscious of the doom that approached. They do not merely plan to assault the Tower of the Moon, he realized with sudden, terrible clarity. They mean to corrupt it from within, to turn its very stones to evil purpose. And if they succeed, he could not finish the thought, for the implications were too dreadful to contemplate. The wizard remained upon the ridge until the last light faded from the western sky, watching the dark industry that proceeded below. He saw great machines of war being assembled in the courtyards of Dol Guldur, catapults and ballistae, but also stranger engines whose purpose he could not divine. He saw forges being built not for the working of iron and steel, but for the shaping of substances that had no name in the common tongue. And deep beneath the hill, in caverns that glowed with their own infernal light, he glimpsed the source of all this industry, a great furnace that burned without fuel, tended by figures that moved with the jerky motion of things long dead. When at last he turned away from that accursed sight, Gandalf's face was grim with the knowledge of what was to come. The shadow was stirring indeed, and its first blow would fall not upon the strong places of the earth, but upon the fairest. For evil, as he had learned through long years of struggle, seeks always to corrupt rather than to destroy, to turn beauty into nightmare and hope into despair. The road to Minas Tirith lay before him, but now he knew that his journey would not end in the White City. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the borders of sight, Minas Ithil stood in its pride and beauty, unaware that even now its doom was being prepared in the dark workshops of Dol Guldur. Time was growing short and the need for action desperate. Yet what could one wizard do against the power that was gathering in the east? The question haunted him as he rode through the darkness, seeking answers that seemed as distant as the stars. 7 days had passed since Gandalf looked upon the cursed hill from afar. 7 days in which he had ridden hard through the borderlands of Gondor, bearing word of what he had seen to those who had ears to hear. Yet even as he spoke his warnings in the halls of the wise, a darker purpose grew in his heart, one that filled him with dread, even as it called to him with the voice of necessity. He would enter Dol Guldur itself. The very thought was madness, as Elrond had told him when they met in secret council beneath the stars of Rivendell. "You cannot hope to stand against the necromancer in his own stronghold," the half-elven lord had said, his ageless face grave with concern. "If indeed Sauron has returned to that place, then to enter it would be to walk willing into the jaws of death." Yet Gandalf knew that knowledge was needed more than safety, understanding more precious than life itself. For if the shadow was indeed preparing to corrupt Minas Ithil, then the wise must know the manner of that corruption, must understand the enemy's methods if they hope to devise any defense. And so, against all counsel and all wisdom, he had returned alone to the borders of the Greenwood, leaving Shadowfax in the care of the elves and proceeding on foot into the dying forest. Now he crouched in the ruins of what had once been a fair glade, where silver birches had danced in the wind and streams had sung over pebbles bright as gems. All was changed, all was corrupted. The trees stood leafless and black, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt the mind to contemplate. The stream ran thick and dark as blood, its voice no longer music, but a low, constant moan that spoke of pain beyond bearing. Before him rose the slopes of Dol Guldur, and at their base yawned an opening that had not been there in the elder days. A great archway carved from the living rock, its stones shaped into forms that belonged to no wholesome architecture. Above the arch were graven runes in the black speech, words that seemed to writhe and shift even as he looked upon them, spelling out promises of power and threats of doom in equal measure. The very air around the entrance shimmered with malice made visible, a heat haze of corruption that distorted sight and made the stomach clench with nausea. From within came sounds that no living throat should make, the scrape of metal on stone, the whisper of robes against bare rock, and underneath it all a chanting in voices that rose and fell like the tide of some poisonous sea. Gandalf drew his cloak tight about him and spoke words of concealment in the ancient tongue of Valinor, wrapping himself in shadows that were not of the enemy's making. The light of his staff he dimmed until it was no brighter than a single candle, though even that small radiance seemed to struggle against the darkness that pressed close on every side. Step by step, he entered the black archway. The passage beyond was carved from stone that had never known the light of sun or moon, its walls smooth as glass and cold as winter. The floor sloped downward at a gentle angle, leading ever deeper into the heart of the hill. Along the walls were set torches that burned with a flame that gave no warmth, their light green and sickly as marsh fire. By this unwholesome illumination, Gandalf saw that the passage was not empty. Shapes moved in the shadows between the torches, not the forms of men or elves or any of the free peoples, but things that had been twisted from their original nature until only malice remained. Some scuttled on too many legs, their eyes gleaming like crimson stars in the darkness. Others walked upright, but with a gait that spoke of bones bent and joints reversed, their limbs moving in ways that nature never intended. All were silent as they went about their business, yet their silence was more terrible than any cry. Deeper he went, past chambers carved from the living rock where forges burned with flames of blue and violet. Here labored creatures that might once have been dwarves, their beards singed away, their hands blackened with the handling of substances that should not exist. They worked without rest or respite, shaping metal that rang like bells when struck, but gave off no honest spark. The things they made were beautiful to look upon, rings and circlets, brooches and chains, yet to Gandalf's eyes they seemed to squirm with inner corruption, as though the very gold from which they were wrought had been tainted at its source. In one chamber, he glimpsed a sight that made his blood run cold. A great map spread upon a table of black marble, showing all the lands from the Shire to the Sea of Rhûn. Upon this map were placed tokens of various shapes and colours, and as Gandalf watched from the shadows, figures robed in black moved these tokens with deliberate care. The largest token, carved from some white stone that gleamed like pearl, stood upon the site of Minas Ithil. Even as he watched, one of the robed figures reached out and turned this token over, revealing its underside to be black as coal. The meaning was clear, and it filled Gandalf with despair. The corruption of the Tower of the Moon was not some distant plan, but an immediate strategy, its execution already begun. Soon, perhaps within days, that fair citadel would be transformed into something that would make strong men weep to look upon. Onward he went, through passages that seemed to wind through the very substance of nightmare. Here were libraries where books bound in leather that had never come from any wholesome beast held knowledge that would blast the mind of any who read it. Here were laboratories where alchemists worked with substances that glowed with their own malevolent light, distilling essences of fear and despair as other men might distill wine from grapes. At last, after what seemed like hours of careful progress through those lightless ways, Gandalf came to a great door of iron and adamant, its surface inscribed with sigils that hurt the eye to look upon. From beyond this door came a sound that made his heart nearly stop with terror. Voices speaking in harmony, yet not the harmony of any earthly choir. This was the music of the spheres turned inside out. Melody become discord, beauty transformed into its own opposite. The door stood slightly ajar, and through that narrow gap leaked a light that was worse than any darkness, a radiance that seemed to drain the life from all it touched. Gandalf knew that he had come to the heart of Dol Guldur, to the very chamber where the necromancer held court. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to turn and run from this place, while his sanity yet remained intact. Yet duty held him fast, and the knowledge that countless lives hung in the balance gave him strength to press forward. Slowly, carefully, he approached the gap in the door and peered within. What he saw there would haunt his dreams for years to come. A great chamber carved from crystal that reflected light in ways that nature never intended, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. In the center of this chamber stood 9 thrones arranged in a circle, and upon 8 of these thrones sat figures in robes of black. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods that seemed to devour light, but from each came a sense of presence that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. Power gained at a price that no sane being would willingly pay. The 9th throne stood empty, but above it hung something that made Gandalf's breath catch in his throat. A shape of shadow and flame that had no fixed form, yet whose very presence filled the chamber with malevolence. This was the necromancer himself, Sauron in his diminished form, still weakened from his defeat, but growing stronger with each passing day. And at the feet of the thrones, bound with chains that gleamed like silver but felt cold as winter, knelt a figure that Gandalf recognized with a shock of horror and pity. It was a man of Gondor, one of the guards of Minas Ithil, his face pale with the torment he had endured, but his eyes still burning with the light of defiance. Here then was both the source of the enemy's knowledge and the first victim of his malice, a captive who had been taken not for what he knew, but for what he represented, the beginning of Minas Ithil's fall. The prisoner who knelt in chains before the 9 thrones was no common guard, as Gandalf had first supposed, but a lord of high lineage whose bearing spoke of royal blood, despite the torments he had endured. His hair, once golden as wheat in summer, hung lank and grey about shoulders that had once borne the weight of command with pride. Yet in his eyes, those eyes that had looked upon the light of the Palantir and gazed across the fair realm of Gondor from the heights of Minas Ithil, there burned still a flame that all the malice of the enemy had not been able to quench. This was Eärnur, son of Eärnil, he who would in later days be the last king of Gondor, though that crown would never rest upon his brow. In this hour he was captain of Minas Ithil, keeper of the Tower of the Moon, and the first among mortals to learn the true extent of the Shadow's returning power. "Speak again of the defences," came a voice from one of the thrones, cold as winter wind through empty halls. The Nazgûl who spoke had once been a king of men in the far south, a lord of Harad whose name was carved upon monuments of black stone. Now he was less than shadow, yet more terrible than any living thing. "Tell us of the passages beneath the tower, of the ways by which the foundations might be reached." Enor raised his head, and though his face was marked by suffering, his voice when he spoke was clear and strong. "I have told you already, servant of darkness. The Tower of the Moon has no secret ways, no hidden passages save those that lead to chambers of light and air. It was built by the hands of Númenóreans, who knew no treachery in their construction, who raised their walls in trust and hope." A sound like laughter came from the shadows above the 9th throne, but it was laughter without mirth, hollow as the wind through dead trees. "Trust," spoke the voice of the necromancer, and at its speaking the very stones seemed to shudder. "Hope. These are the tools by which the noblest works are undone. Tell me, son of kings, what trust did Isildur place in his own strength when he stood upon the slopes of Mount Doom? What hope burned in his heart when he claimed my ring for his own?" At these words, Gandalf felt his blood turn to ice, for here was knowledge that should have been hidden from the enemy. The knowledge of Isildur's failure, of the ring's survival. Yet how could Sauron know of these things unless the darkness had sources of information that the wise had not suspected? "You know of the ring," Enor said, and though he tried to keep the wonder from his voice, Gandalf could hear the fear that crept into his words. "You know that it was not destroyed?" "I know many things, Lord of Gondor," the necromancer replied, and now his voice was soft as silk, yet in its softness lay a menace that made the air itself seem thick with poison. "I know that even now it lies hidden in the waters of Anduin, waiting for a hand to claim it. I know that the White Council believes me defeated, diminished beyond the power of return. And I know that the Tower of the Moon shall be the first jewel in the crown of my restoration." From another of the thrones came a voice like the whisper of graveclothes in the wind. This was she who had once been a sorceress queen of the Far East, whose beauty had been legend among the kings of men until she accepted a ring of power and became something that no mortal eye could bear to look upon. "The foundations are the key," she said. "Not the walls that rise above the earth, fair though they may be, but the roots that anchor them to the living rock. Corrupt the foundation, and all that stands upon it shall crumble." "But how?" demanded another of the 9, he who had been a king of the Númenóreans themselves before his fall. "The stone of which Minas Ithil is built was quarried from the hills of Mindolluin, blessed by the Eldar in the making, set in place with songs of power. It will not yield easily to corruption." It was then that the necromancer spoke again, and in his words, Gandalf heard the full horror of the plan that was being laid. "There are ways, my servants, ways that were old when the world was young. Not all corruption comes from without. The greatest evil is that which springs from within, from the turning of love to hatred, of hope to despair. The men of Gondor trust in their tower's strength, believe in its purity. What if that very trust became the instrument of their undoing?" From the folds of shadow above the throne, there emerged a shape that made Gandalf's heart quail. A globe of crystal, dark as midnight, yet shot through with veins of sickly light. This was a Palantir, one of the 7 seeing stones of Númenor, but corrupted now and turned to evil purpose. "Behold," the necromancer continued, "the stone of Ithil Anor, which was kept in the great tower of the Sunset Isle before its drowning. Long have I held it. Long have I bent it to my will. Through this stone, I can speak to its kindred, wherever they may be found. And one such stone rests even now in the highest chamber of Minas Ithil, where the captain of that tower looks into it each night, believing that he gazes upon visions sent by the Valar for the guidance of Gondor. The full horror of the revelation struck Gandalf like a physical blow. If Sauron could corrupt the Palantir of Minas Ithil, could send false visions to its users, then he could drive them to madness without ever setting foot within their walls. The very tool they trusted for wisdom would become the instrument of their destruction. Eärnur, too, had understood, and the color drained from his face as he realized the implications. "No," he whispered, "the visions I have seen, the dreams that have troubled my sleep, they were not sent by the powers of light, but by you. The corruption I have felt growing in the tower's stones, the sickness that has come upon the gardens, it begins with the seeing stone." "Even so," the necromancer confirmed, and now his voice held a note of triumph that chilled the blood. "Each night when you look into the Palantir, seeking guidance for the defense of your realm, you open your mind to my influence. Each vision I send weakens your will, clouds your judgment, fills your heart with doubt and fear. And through you, that corruption spreads to your men, to the very stones of your tower. Soon, very soon, Minas Ithil will be ripe for the taking. Not by siege or storm, but by the simple expedient of opening its gates from within." "I will resist," Eärnur said, though his voice shook with the knowledge of how terribly he had been deceived. "I will warn my men, destroy the seeing stone if need be. You will not have the tower so easily." "Will you not?" The necromancer's laughter was like the sound of grinding glass. "But you are here, Lord of Gondor, chained in my halls, far from your tower and your men. Who will carry your warning? Who will tell them that their captain has been made a tool of the enemy? Even now, as we speak, your lieutenant looks into the Palantir in your stead, seeking word of your fate. And what visions do you think he sees there?" The silence that followed was more terrible than any sound, for in it lay the weight of utter despair. Gandalf realized that he was witnessing not just the corruption of a single tower, but the beginning of a strategy that could bring down all the defenses of the West. If Sauron could control the Palantiri, could turn the seeing stones into instruments of his will, then no stronghold would be safe from his influence. "There is more," the necromancer continued, his voice now soft with malicious pleasure. "The corruption of Minas Ithil is but the first step in a greater design. When the Tower of the Moon has become the Tower of Dark Sorcery, when its stones glow with unclean light and its gardens bloom with poisonous flowers, then shall the fear of it spread throughout Gondor. Men will look upon what was once their fairest citadel and despair, knowing that if such beauty can be corrupted, then nothing is safe from the shadow's touch." From one of the thrones came a voice like the hiss of serpents. "And from that tower of fear shall ride the Nazgûl, no longer forced to hide in shadow, but able to take physical form once more. The very stones of Minas Ithil shall become their armor, its corrupted light their weapon. The terror they inspire will go before them like a herald, and the strong places of Gondor shall fall without a blow being struck." Eärnur closed his eyes, and for a moment his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of knowledge too terrible to bear. When he opened them again, there were tears upon his cheeks. Not tears of self-pity, but of grief for all that would be lost when the Shadow's plan came to fruition. "You have told me these things," he said slowly, "knowing that I cannot prevent them. Is this, then, your final cruelty, to let me understand the full scope of my failure?" "Not final," the necromancer replied, and in his voice was a gentleness more terrible than any threat. "There remains one service you may yet perform, one way by which you might spare your people some measure of suffering. Swear fealty to me, accept a ring of power from my hand, and you shall live to see the new age that is coming. Refuse, and you shall die here in darkness. your warning unheard, your sacrifice meaningless. It was then that Enur raised his head and looked directly into the shadows where Sauron's presence hung like a storm cloud, and in that look was all the pride and defiance of the kings of Númenor. "I am Enur, son of Enil," he said, his voice ringing clear in the crystal chamber. "I am heir to Isildur and Anarion, child of the sea and the star. Though you corrupt my tower and enslave my people, though you turn all the world to shadow, I will not serve you. I will not bow. I will not yield." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch for an eternity, heavy with the weight of choices made and fate sealed. Then, from the shadows above the ninth throne, came a sigh that might have been regret, or might have been the prelude to wrath beyond imagining. Deep within the bowels of Dol Guldur, where the very stones wept with malice and the air hung thick as a burial shroud, Gandalf felt the weight of ancient evil pressing upon his spirit like iron chains. The fortress had been cleansed once, or so the wise had believed, but now corruption seeped from every crevice, and in the deepest chamber, a voice spoke from shadow. A voice that chilled the grey wizard's very soul. "So," came the whisper, neither fully sound nor silence, but something that lived in the space between thought and fear. "The grey pilgrim returns to places where his light has no power. Do you not tire, Mithrandir, of fighting battles already lost?" The wizard's staff blazed white in the darkness, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted as if alive. Yet for all his power, the light seemed to barely hold the encroaching gloom at bay. Here, in this cursed place, the very air resisted illumination, as though darkness itself had taken substance and form. "I know you," Gandalf spoke, his voice steady despite the terror that gnawed at his heart. "You are the shadow that fled Dol Guldur, the darkness that festers still in the forgotten places of the world. But you are not yet strong enough to face the light openly. Why do you linger here, Wraith?" A sound like bitter laughter echoed from the stones themselves. "Linger? Nay, old fool, I prepare. While you and your kind debate in your bright halls and speak of peace, I have been building. Soon, very soon, I shall have a fortress to rival the towers of your precious Minas Tirith, but turned to darker purpose. Where your white city seeks to preserve, mine shall consume. Where yours stands as beacon, mine shall draw in all light and leave only shadow." The temperature in the chamber dropped until frost began to form upon the wizard's robes. Through the gathering darkness, shapes began to move, not quite substantial, but more than mere phantoms. They whispered in languages that predated the sun, speaking of stone and mortar, of towers that would pierce the sky like black needles, of a citadel that would be beautiful in its corruption. "Minas Ithil," the voice continued, and now Gandalf could sense the smile behind the words. "Cruel and cold as winter. The tower of the rising moon, so fair it stands upon its hill, so proud in its white marble. But marble can be stained. Mithrandir, light can be twisted. What was made to welcome the moon's gentle radiance can be turned to trap and pervert it. Already my servants walk its halls. Already my influence seeps into its foundations, like poison into a well." The grey wizard raised his staff higher, and its light flared bright enough to drive back the shadows for a moment. In that brief illumination, he saw them, the plans etched into the very walls by some unholy art. Diagrams of corruption, blueprints for transformation, the careful architectural study of how to turn beauty into horror while maintaining its essential form. "You speak of servants," Gandalf said, his voice carrying across the chamber like a challenge. "Yet you hide here in darkness, afraid to show yourself. What power do you truly wield, Shadow, save that of whispers and fear?" "Power?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere now, as if the stones themselves were speaking. "I shall show you power, grey fool. I shall take their Tower of the Moon and make it mine. I shall corrupt its very stone until it glows with sickly light, until its beauty becomes a lure for the unwary, until its halls echo with screams instead of songs. And when that work is done, when Minas Ithil has become Minas Morgul, then shall you know the extent of my reach." The darkness pressed closer, and Gandalf felt the presence of something vast and malevolent focusing its attention upon him. This was no mere spirit of shadow, no displaced phantom seeking refuge in ruins. This was intelligence, will, and malice combined, a force that had learned patience through long defeat and was now ready to act with calculated precision. "The moon shall rise red over my tower," the voice whispered, "and its light shall carry my will into every corner of Middle-earth. The very beacon that once stood for hope and vigilance shall become a lighthouse of despair, drawing ships of men's souls onto the rocks of their own destruction." As the voice faded into echoes, Gandalf felt the weight of prophecy settling upon his shoulders. This was no idle threat, no boast of a defeated enemy. This was a declaration of intent from a power that had the knowledge and will to make good its promises. The transformation of Minas Ithil would be no mere conquest, but a perversion of everything it represented, a masterstroke of corruption that would wound the very heart of the free peoples. In the growing silence, the wizard heard something else, the sound of stone being carved, of ancient foundations being prepared, of evil taking on architectural form. Somewhere, in ways he could not yet fully comprehend, the construction of Minas Morgul had already begun. The chamber erupted into conflict as Gandalf's light blazed forth like a star born in the depths of night. Yet this was no mere battle of sword and sorcery, but a clash of fundamental forces: order against chaos, preservation against corruption, the flame imperishable against the void that sought to devour all things. "You think your little light can stand against the darkness I have gathered?" The necromancer's voice rose to a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of Dol Guldur. "I who have walked in shadow since the world was young, I who have learned to make darkness itself a tool and weapon." But Gandalf did not answer with words. Instead, he planted his staff upon the stone floor and spoke a word of power that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the Elder Days. The white light that emanated from Glamdring intensified until it seemed as though a piece of the sun itself had been brought into the depths of the earth. The shadows fled before it like living things, and for a moment, the true scope of the evil that had taken root in this place was revealed. The walls were covered with diagrams and calculations, but not merely the architectural plans he had glimpsed before. These were formulae for corruption itself, mathematical expressions of how light could be bent and twisted, geometric proofs of how beauty could be turned to horror while maintaining its essential form. Here was the theoretical foundation for the transformation of Minas Ithil, worked out with the precision of a master craftsman and the malice of pure evil. "Yes," hissed the voice, now seeming to come from the very diagrams themselves. "Look upon my work, grey fool. See how thoroughly I have planned. Every stone of that fair tower has been studied, every weakness in its construction catalogued. I know where to place my influence so that the corruption will spread like cracks in ice, following the natural stresses until the entire structure is compromised." The wizard studied the walls with growing horror. This was not the work of random malice, but of intelligence applied with surgical precision to the problem of evil. The necromancer had not simply planned to destroy Minas Ithil. He had designed its transformation down to the smallest detail, ensuring that its corruption would be both total and self-sustaining. The moon letters inscribed in its foundation stones, the voice continued with evident satisfaction, so carefully placed to channel the gentle light of Isil, they can be altered with but the slightest pressure applied at precisely the right moment. What once drew down silver radiance will then pull at the moon itself, bending its light through spiritual prisms of despair until it shines pale, and sickly over a tower that has become its own opposite. Gandalf raised his staff and spoke another word, this one in the tongue of the Valar themselves. The light that blazed forth was no longer merely bright. It carried within it the very essence of hope and resistance. Where it touched the evil diagrams, they began to smolder and fade, as though the stone itself rejected the corruption that had been carved into it. "You cannot unmake what I have wrought." The necromancer's rage was palpable now, a force that pressed against the wizard like a physical weight. The knowledge is already spread, the servants already placed. Even if you burn every diagram in this chamber, the work will continue. My architects have memorized these plans. My engineers have prepared the materials. My corrupted men walk even now within the walls of the Tower of the Moon. The battle raged not just in the physical realm, but in the realm of ideas themselves. Each flash of Gandalf's light sought to burn away, not just the immediate evil, but the very concepts that gave it form. Yet for every shadow he banished, two more seemed to take its place, as though the darkness was learning from each exchange, adapting and evolving its strategies. Do you begin to understand? The voice had grown quieter now, but somehow more menacing for its restraint. This is not a war that can be won with sword or staff, with light or fire. This is a war of corruption, of seduction, of making the fair seem foul and the foul seem fair. When my tower is complete, men will look upon it and think it beautiful, even as it destroys them. They will walk willingly into its halls, drawn by its transformed radiance, never knowing that they embrace their own doom. Gandalf's light began to waver, not from weakness but from the sheer scope of what he opposed. This was not mere evil, but evil made systematic, given form and method and long-term purpose. The transformation of Minas Ithil would be just the beginning, a proof of concept for corruption that could be applied anywhere, to any symbol of hope or beauty. The white tree itself, whispered the necromancer, grows from soil that can be poisoned. The seeing stones can be made to show false visions. Even the Shire, that green sanctuary of innocence, has fields that could be made to grow only thorns. All that you protect can be turned against itself, made into a weapon for its own destruction. But in that moment of near despair, Gandalf found something the necromancer had not anticipated. Not greater power, but deeper purpose. His light steadied and grew, not brighter but more solid, more real. For he realized that the very attempt to corrupt light into darkness revealed a fundamental truth. Darkness could only exist in relation to light, could only define itself in opposition to what it sought to destroy. "You have shown me your plans," the wizard said quietly, "and in doing so, you have shown me their weakness. For all your calculations and preparations, there is one thing you cannot account for, one variable you cannot control or corrupt." "And what is that, old fool?" "Choice," Gandalf replied, and his staff blazed with renewed fire. "Free will, the decision made in darkness and difficulty to choose light anyway. You can corrupt stone and bend moonbeams, but you cannot corrupt the choosing itself, and that is where your grand design will ultimately fail." With those words, he struck his staff against the floor one final time, and the chamber filled with light so pure and terrible that even the stones cried out. When the radiance faded, the diagrams were gone, burned away not by heat, but by the simple affirmation of hope in the face of despair. Yet, as he turned to leave, Gandalf heard the necromancer's final words, spoken not in rage, but with quiet certainty. "The plans are burned, but the knowledge remains. The tower will still be built, Mithrandir, and when it rises in its dark glory, you will remember this day and know that you could have stopped it here, in this chamber, if only you had been willing to pay the price. The grey wizard paused at the threshold, but did not turn back. Some prices, he knew, were too high to pay, even to prevent great evil. The true battle was not here in this place of shadows, but in the hearts and minds of those who would choose, day by day, moment by moment, between light and darkness. Behind him, the chamber fell silent, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of patience, the quiet of something vast and malevolent that could afford to wait, knowing that time and corruption would accomplish what force and fury could not. The towers of Rivendell rose before Gandalf like fingers of welcome after the darkness of Dol Guldur, their graceful spires catching the last light of evening and holding it like captured starfire. Yet even in this sanctuary of the wise, the grey wizard felt the weight of what he had witnessed pressing upon his spirit, like a physical burden. The knowledge he carried was too dark for casual sharing, too urgent for delay. Elrond stood upon the bridge that spanned the rushing waters, his face grave with concern that deepened as he took in Gandalf's haggard appearance. The wizard's robes bore the stains of shadow, and his eyes held depths of trouble that spoke of encounters with powers that should have remained buried. "You return from dark places, Mithrandir," the Lord of Rivendell said softly. "The very air around you whispers of malice endured and barely overcome. Come, we must speak at once. Galadriel and Saruman have already arrived, as has Radagast, though he brings tidings from the wild lands that add to our growing unease." They walked in silence through the halls of the last homely house, past tapestries that depicted the great deeds of ages past, and gardens where the music of fountains could not quite drown out the urgency of their purpose. In the great council chamber, the assembled members of the White Council waited with faces that reflected the gravity of the hour. Galadriel, fairest of the Eldar still dwelling in Middle-earth, turned her piercing gaze upon Gandalf as he entered. In her eyes, ancient and terrible in their wisdom, he saw recognition of the darkness he had faced, and understanding of the price he had paid to bring back this knowledge. "The necromancer has shown his hand," she said without preamble, her voice carrying harmonics of power that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the chamber. "I have felt the stirring of malice in the east, the gathering of will and purpose around deeds of corruption. What have you seen, Grey Pilgrim?" Gandalf took his place in the circle, noting how even Saruman, usually so composed in his white robes and bearing of authority, leaned forward with obvious concern. The chief of the order had lost some of his customary arrogance, replaced by something that might have been genuine alarm. "I have seen the plans," Gandalf began, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "Not merely for conquest or destruction, but for corruption so complete and systematic that it turns our very symbols of hope into weapons against us. The necromancer does not seek merely to destroy Minas Ithil. He means to transform it into something that will corrupt by its very existence." He spoke then of the chamber beneath Dol Guldur, of the diagrams carved into living stone, of the voice that had revealed knowledge too terrible for easy comprehension. As his words painted pictures of architectural corruption and spiritual engineering, the faces around him grew increasingly grave. "Minas Morgul," Elrond repeated when Gandalf had finished. "A tower of sorcery, where once stood a tower of watching. But surely the foundations themselves would resist such transformation. The stones of Minas Ithil were laid with blessings, set with power to endure against the darkness." "That is precisely what makes the plan so insidious," Gandalf replied. "The necromancer has studied those very blessings, mapped their patterns and purposes. He does not seek to destroy them, but to pervert them, to use the tower's own spiritual architecture against itself. The moon letters that once channeled Isil's light will be made to bend and twist that radiance until it becomes a beacon of despair." Saruman stirred in his seat, his white robes rustling like wings. "You speak of theoretical knowledge, Gandalf. Surely the gap between conception and execution is vast. Even if this shadow has such plans, the practical difficulties of their implementation are already being overcome. Gandalf interrupted, his voice sharp with certainty. This is no mere scheming of malice, Saruman. This is engineering on a scale that rivals the great works of the Elder Days. The necromancer has agents within Minas Ithil itself, servants who have been placed with patience over long years. When the time comes for transformation, the corruption will begin from within. Galadriel rose from her seat and moved to the great window that looked eastward toward the distant shadows. I have seen this in the mirror, she said quietly. A tower that glows with sickly light, beautiful and terrible, drawing the unwary like moths to flame. And I have seen what comes after, the spreading darkness, the corruption of other strongholds, the slow strangulation of hope itself. Then we must act, Radagast said suddenly, his voice carrying the urgency of one who had spent too long in the wild places and had grown accustomed to quick decisions. Surely an assault upon Dol Guldur itself, a cleansing fire to burn out this nest of corruption before it can spread its poison further. But Elrond shook his head slowly. We tried that before, and thought we had succeeded. Yet the darkness merely withdrew, regrouped, learned from its defeat. Oh, but yeah, a direct assault might drive it away again, but it would also alert it to our knowledge of its plans. Better perhaps to move with subtlety, to counter its schemes with strategies of our own. What strategies can counter this? Saruman demanded, and there was something in his voice that made Gandalf look at him more closely. If the necromancer has indeed prepared so thoroughly, if his corruption is to be so systematic and complete, what hope have we of meaningful resistance? It was Galadriel who answered, her voice carrying certainties that seemed to come from depths of wisdom beyond the reach of ordinary thought. There is always hope, Curunir, though it may lie in paths we have not yet considered. The enemy seeks to corrupt what is beautiful and turn it to his service. But beauty renewed may prove stronger than beauty corrupted. What has been made dark may yet be cleansed, if the cleansing comes at the proper time and in the proper way. You speak in riddles, lady, Saruman replied, but his tone held respect for her wisdom even as it showed his frustration with her cryptic words. Perhaps because the truth itself partakes of riddle, she answered. But this much I can say plainly. The necromancer's plans depend upon despair, upon the assumption that once corruption takes hold, it cannot be reversed. If we can maintain hope, if we can preserve centers of light and life and joy that remain untouched by his malice, then his grand design becomes vulnerable to forces he has not accounted for. Gandalf nodded slowly, beginning to see the shape of what she suggested. Small things, he murmured. Hidden things. Places and people too humble for the great designs of evil to notice or account for. The Shire, Galadriel agreed, and others like it. Sanctuaries not of power but of innocence, not of great deeds but of simple goodness. These may prove to be cracks in the enemy's grand design, places where his corruption cannot take root because there is nothing for it to grasp and twist. The council continued long into the night as the wise debated strategies of resistance and preservation. But already Gandalf's mind was turning toward paths that led west, toward green hills and comfortable holes, toward a people who valued gardens over glory and good meals over grand destinies. For if the necromancer sought to corrupt the great symbols of power and hope, perhaps the answer lay not in protecting those symbols, but in nurturing smaller, humbler things that evil might overlook until it was too late. The construction of Minas Morgul might proceed according to plan, but the preservation of the Shire, that could be a work of equal importance, though conducted in secret and with none of the dark grandeur of the enemy's designs. As the stars wheeled overhead and the council dispersed to their rest, Gandalf remained at the window, gazing westward toward lands where the concerns of the great world seemed very far away. Tomorrow would bring new plans and preparations, but tonight he allowed himself to think of simple things: hobbit holes and garden gates, pipe smoke and stories told by firelight, the small domestic details that made life worth preserving. For in the end, he reflected, it was not the great towers that made Middle-earth worth defending, but the simple homes that sheltered within their shadows. And if the enemy sought to corrupt beauty into horror, then perhaps the true victory lay in preserving beauty, so pure and simple that no corruption could touch it. The darkness was gathering, but so too was the light. Not in great blazes of power, but in the gentle glow of windows at evening, the warm hearths where families gathered, the quiet places where ordinary folk lived, ordinary lives of extraordinary worth. The misty mountains stood stark against the dawn sky as Gandalf made his way northward, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the early light like distant flames. Behind him lay the councils of the wise, with their debates and deliberations. Ahead lay a different sort of challenge, the awakening of powers that had slumbered too long in their halls of stone, content with memories of ancient glory, while the world grew dark around them. The path to Erebor was treacherous at this season, with ice that concealed itself beneath thin coverings of snow, and winds that carried voices of old malice down from the high passes. Yet the grey wizard pressed on with the urgency of one who knew that time was running short. In his mind, the plans he had seen carved into the walls of Dol Guldur burned with terrible clarity. Not just the corruption of Minas Ithil, but the larger design of which it was merely the first stroke. For the necromancer's true genius lay not in any single act of malice, but in the way his various schemes would reinforce each other. The taking of the Tower of the Moon would provide him with a base from which to project power across the lands between the Mountains of Shadow and the Great River. From there, he could strike at the heart of Gondor itself, while simultaneously threatening the northern kingdoms and cutting the lines of communication between the various peoples of Middle-earth. But those plans assumed that the ancient powers would remain dormant, that the kingdoms beneath the mountains would continue their long isolation, that the connections forged in the elder days would remain severed by time and the accumulated grievances of centuries. If those assumptions could be proven false, if the old alliances could be rekindled, if the sleeping strength of the North could be awakened, then the necromancer's calculations would be thrown into disarray. The great gates of Erebor loomed before him at last, their massive stone doors sealed shut as they had been for generations since the coming of the dragon. Yet even here, at the threshold of the lonely mountain, Gandalf could sense the stirring of life within. The exile of the dwarves had not been permanent. Already there were signs that some among them contemplated return, that the ancient halls were calling to their children, with voices that grew stronger year by year. He did not approach the gates directly, for he knew they would not open to his knock. Instead, he sought the hidden paths, known only to those who had walked these ways in the elder days. Routes that led to chambers and passages, forgotten by all save the mountain itself. Through these, he made his way into the heart of Erebor, following corridors that had not felt the tread of feet for decades. The throne room of the Mountain Kings lay in darkness, its great seat empty beneath a ceiling that had once blazed with the light of many lamps. Here, in this place of silence and shadow, Gandalf paused to contemplate the work that lay before him. To wake the sleeping powers of the North would require more than mere persuasion. It would require the rekindling of dreams that had been deferred so long they had nearly been forgotten. But not quite forgotten, he murmured to himself and set his staff against the stone floor. Its light blazed forth, not with the terrible brightness he had wielded in Dol Guldur, but with a gentler radiance that seemed to call forth answering gleams from the walls themselves. For these stones remembered their glory, even as they mourned their abandonment. In that light, he saw them, the maps and records that the dwarves had left behind in their haste to flee the dragon's coming. Here were the detailed charts of all the roads beneath the mountains, the carefully maintained genealogies that traced bloodlines back to the making of the world, the trade agreements and defensive pacts that had once bound the scattered kindreds together in common cause. Most important of all, he found what he had come seeking: the ancient map of the lonely mountain itself, with its secret passages and hidden doors marked in runes that few now living could read. This was the key that could unlock not just the physical fortress of Erebor, but the hearts and minds of a people who had been too long in exile from their rightful home. Yet, as he studied the ancient parchment, Gandalf understood that possession of the map was only the beginning. The real challenge would be finding the right person to carry it, someone with the courage to face a dragon, the wisdom to understand what was at stake, and the connections necessary to forge the alliances that the coming darkness would make essential. His thoughts turned to Thrain, last seen wandering in the wild lands east of the Misty Mountains, driven by grief and madness to seek a death that had thus far eluded him. The rightful heir to the throne of Erebor carried with him not just the pain of loss, but the ring that marked his royal authority, one of the 7 given to the dwarf lords in the ancient days, an artifact of power that the enemy would covet greatly. But Thrain was lost, perhaps beyond recovery, and his son, Thorin, dwelt in exile among the Blue Mountains, nursing grievances and dreams of vengeance that burned bright but gave little warmth to those around him. To kindle the flame of return in such a heart would require more than maps and promises. It would require the careful application of pride and hope in exactly the right proportions. Gandalf folded the map carefully and placed it within his robes, feeling the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak. This was how the great works began, not with grand pronouncements or marshaled armies, but with a single piece of parchment carried by a solitary traveler through the darkness of the world. Outside the mountain, the wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant places, the pine forests of the north, the grasslands of Rohan, the gardens of the Shire, where simple folk tended their plots and worried about weather and harvest rather than the great strategies of good and evil. All of these would be affected by what transpired in the halls beneath the earth. Yet few of them would ever know how their fates had been shaped by decisions made in darkness and silence. The Grey Wizard made his way back through the forgotten passages, his mind already turning toward the long road that lay ahead. There would be meetings to arrange, carefully chosen words to plant in receptive ears, the delicate work of nurturing hope where despair had taken root. And always, underneath it all, the knowledge of what would happen if he failed. The tower of sickly light rising in the east, the slow strangulation of all that was fair and free, the victory of corruption over hope. But failure was not yet written in the book of days. The maps were drawn, the path was clear, and somewhere in the wide world, there walked those who would answer the call when it came. The stirring of the north had begun, though it would be years before its effects became apparent to those who watched the great game from afar. As he emerged into the daylight, Gandalf looked back once at the sealed gates of Erebor. "Your time of sleeping is nearly ended," he said softly to the mountain itself. "Soon the hammers will ring in your halls again, and the ancient songs will echo from your stones. But first, a longer journey must be taken, and harder paths must be walked by those who have the courage to reclaim their inheritance." The wind carried his words away across the desolate lands, but the mountains seemed to hear them nonetheless. Deep in its heart, where the roots of stone reached down toward the fires of the earth, something stirred in response, not yet awakening, but no longer entirely asleep. The road from the Misty Mountains wound downward through valleys where the spring came early and the grass grew green beside streams that laughed their way toward distant seas. Here, in the gentler lands west of the Great Peaks, the very air seemed to carry whispers of peace and contentment, of lives lived in harmony with the turning of seasons and the simple rhythms that had governed the Shire since time immemorial. Gandalf felt the weight of his recent journeys lifting from his shoulders as he approached the borders of that blessed realm. Behind him lay the darkness of Dol Guldur, the urgency of councils, the cold majesty of abandoned mountain halls, all the grand machinery of the great game that determined the fate of nations. But ahead lay something infinitely more precious, a land where the greatest concerns were the proper time for planting turnips and whether the weather would hold for the harvest. The Green Dragon stood at the crossroads where the East Road met the Bywater Bridge, its windows glowing warm and yellow in the gathering dusk. From within came the sound of voices raised in song, not the ancient lays of heroes and high deeds that echoed in the halls of elves and men, but simple tunes about beer and walking and the particular satisfaction of a good meal after a day's honest work. As he pushed open the door and stepped inside, the Grey Wizard felt something in his heart that had been closed too long beginning to open again. Here was the antidote to all the darkness he had witnessed. The fundamental goodness of folk who asked little from the world save the chance to live their lives in peace and comfort, who measured success not in kingdoms conquered or enemies defeated, but in gardens tended and friendships maintained. Gandalf. The cry went up from a dozen throats as the hobbits of the neighborhood recognized their old friend. "It's been an age since you've darkened our door, wizard. Come, sit by the fire and tell us what news you bring from the wide world." But even as he settled into the familiar chair by the hearth and accepted the mug of ale pressed into his hands, Gandalf's mind was occupied with thoughts that had little to do with the comfortable chatter around him. For among all the hobbits in all the Shire, there was one in particular he had come to see, one whose name had come to him like a gift during his darkest moments in the Council of the Wise. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End was known throughout Hobbiton as something of an oddity, a respectable hobbit from a respectable family who nonetheless displayed certain eccentricities that set him apart from his neighbors. He was given to taking long walks by himself, to reading books that had nothing to do with practical matters, and to entertaining strange guests who brought with them the dust of distant roads and tales of places that existed only in maps and legends. More importantly, he was one of the few hobbits who listened, truly listened, when stories were told of the great world beyond the borders of the Shire. While his neighbors might enjoy a good tale for its entertainment value, Bilbo seemed to understand that behind the stories lay realities that might someday intrude upon even the most sheltered of lives. "He's not here tonight," said Bungo Bracegirdle, noticing the direction of Gandalf's gaze. "Our Bilbo's taken to spending his evenings at home more often of late. Says he's working on his book, some nonsense about writing down all the old stories and songs he's collected over the years, as if anyone would want to read such things." But Gandalf nodded thoughtfully, for he suspected that Bilbo's book might prove more valuable than his neighbors imagined. In a world where the great libraries were few and far between, where much ancient knowledge was locked away in towers and temples, there was wisdom in preserving the stories that ordinary folk told by their firesides. For often, the truth survived in such tales, long after it had been forgotten by the learned. The evening passed pleasantly enough, with songs and stories, and the comfortable gossip of a small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet all the while, Gandalf found himself thinking of the larger currents that flowed beneath the surface of such gatherings. These hobbits spoke of their gardens and their genealogies, their business dealings and their neighborly disputes, never dreaming that their peaceful existence depended upon the vigilance of guardians they would never meet, upon battles fought in places they could not pronounce. Yet perhaps that was as it should be, for if the purpose of the great struggle was to preserve the right of simple folk to live simple lives, then the very fact that these hobbits could gather in their tavern and worry about nothing more pressing than the weather was itself a kind of victory. When the evening's festivities finally began to wind down, Gandalf took his leave and made his way through the quiet lanes of Hobbiton toward the hill where Bag End stood beneath its great oak tree. The round door was painted a cheerful green, and warm light spilled from the windows to pool on the garden path like scattered gold. Bilbo answered his knock with a lamp in his hand and a smile of genuine welcome on his face. "Gandalf, how wonderful to see you again. Come in, come in. I was just putting the kettle on. You arrive at the perfect moment, as always." The Hobbit hole was warm and comfortable, with its round rooms and low ceilings that seemed designed to make visitors feel at home rather than impressed. Books lined the walls, not the ponderous tomes of scholarship that filled the libraries of Rivendell, but collections of stories and songs, maps of distant lands, accounts of journeys taken by travelers who had dared to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of their birth. "I've been thinking about you quite a lot lately," Bilbo said as he bustled about preparing tea and setting out plates of seed cake and honey butter. "Not that there's anything unusual in that. I often think about my friends, of course, but these thoughts have been different somehow, more urgent if you take my meaning, as if something was stirring, something that might change everything we've grown comfortable with." Gandalf studied his host with new interest. Hobbits were not generally given to premonitions, but they possessed an intuitive wisdom that often compensated for their lack of formal learning. If Bilbo sensed that change was coming, it might mean that the currents of destiny were running deeper than even the wise had suspected. "Change often comes whether we will it or not," the wizard said carefully. "The question is whether we meet it with courage or let it overwhelm us through inaction. Tell me, my dear Bilbo, what do you see when you look at your maps? What do you think of when you read your books of distant places?" The Hobbit settled into his favorite chair with his tea, his eyes growing distant as he considered the question. "I think of all the places I'll never see," he said finally. "All the wonders that exist just beyond the edges of my comfortable little world. Sometimes I dream of walking roads that lead to mountains and forests and cities I can barely imagine. And when I wake up, I feel restless, as if this peaceful life, pleasant as it is, might not be enough after all. And what would you say if I told you that such dreams might not always remain dreams? That the time might come when the road would call to you with a voice you could not ignore?" Bilbo laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. "I'd say you were talking to the wrong hobbit, my dear Gandalf. I'm a Baggins of Bag End after all. We don't go on adventures. We have nice, comfortable homes and regular meals and gardens that don't tend themselves. The furthest I've ever traveled from this hill is the Old Forest, and that was quite far enough. Thank you very much." Yet, even as he spoke, Gandalf could see the longing in his eyes, the same restlessness that had been growing stronger over the years, fed by stories and maps, and the endless vista of possibilities that stretched beyond the familiar boundaries of the Shire. Here was the seed of something greater than the Hobbit himself suspected, a potential that waited only for the right moment and the right opportunity to bloom into action. "Of course," the wizard said mildly, "I was merely speaking hypothetically. After all, what need could the wide world have for the services of a comfortable hobbit who wants nothing more than to tend his garden in peace?" But the seed had been planted, and Gandalf could see it taking root in the fertile soil of Bilbo's imagination. The hobbit tried to return to safer topics, the weather, the neighbors, the small matters that filled his days. But his mind kept drifting back to the maps on his walls and the stories in his books, to the possibility that somewhere beyond the horizon lay adventures waiting for those brave enough to seek them. The evening passed in comfortable conversation, but when Gandalf finally took his leave, he carried with him the knowledge that his instincts had been correct. In this unlikely hobbit lay precisely the combination of innocence and curiosity of comfort-loving practicality and half-hidden yearning for adventure that might prove essential in the struggles to come. For the great evil that gathered in the east sought to corrupt power and glory, to turn the mighty symbols of hope into weapons of despair. But what could it make of a simple hobbit who wanted nothing more than a good meal and a comfortable chair by the fire? How could corruption take hold in a heart that valued seed cake over gold, friendship over fame, the simple pleasure of a well-tended garden over the grand ambitions that drove the affairs of kings and nations? As he walked back through the sleeping lanes of Hobbiton, Gandalf found himself smiling, despite the weight of knowledge he carried. The necromancer might build his tower of sorcery, might corrupt the very stones of Minas Ithil until they glowed with sickly light, but he had not accounted for the power of small things, simple things, things that seemed too humble to matter in the great game of nations. A hobbit, a dragon, a mountain full of treasure. These were the elements from which the counterstroke might be fashioned. Not through grand armies or mighty magic, but through the courage of ordinary folk willing to step beyond the boundaries of their comfortable lives when duty called. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the east, plans of corruption continued their measured progress toward fulfillment. But here in the west, under the gentle light of the Shire's lamps, other plans were beginning to take shape. Plans that would turn the enemy's very assumptions against him. Plans that would prove that the smallest light could drive back the greatest darkness if it burned with sufficient courage and hope. The blue mountains rose like ancient teeth against the western sky, their peaks worn smooth by ages of wind and weather, their slopes clothed in forests that had grown old while the world was still young. Here, in the halls carved deep into the living rock, the exiled dwarves of Erebor had made their home for generations, nursing their grievances and dreaming of return to the mountain of their fathers. Gandalf approached the great gates as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows between the stone pillars that marked the entrance to Thorin's halls. The guards who watched the threshold knew him of old, for the Grey Wizard had been a welcome guest in these chambers for many years, bringing news from the wide world and sometimes counsel when the burden of leadership grew too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear. "He is in the armory," said Balin, eldest of Thorin's advisors, as he led Gandalf through corridors that echoed with the sound of hammer on anvil. Working the iron as he always does when his thoughts grow dark. "The news you bring will be welcome or terrible. I can see it in your face, old friend." They found Thorin Oakenshield bent over a forge, his massive frame silhouetted against the red glow of the coals, as he shaped a blade with practiced strokes. The exile of the dwarf lord had not diminished his skill at the ancient crafts of his people, and the weapon taking form beneath his hammer would have been worthy of kings in the elder days. "Gandalf," he said without looking up from his work, "I wondered when you would come. The winds have been bringing strange news from the east. Rumors of shadows stirring, of old enemies gathering strength. But surely you bring more than rumors from your journeys." The wizard waited until the blade was quenched and the immediate work of the forge complete before he spoke. "I bring opportunity, Thorin, son of Thrain, the chance to reclaim what was lost, to restore the glory of your house, and perhaps to strike a blow against the darkness that threatens all the free peoples of Middle-earth." Thorin set down his hammer and turned to face his guest, his eyes bright with the fire that had sustained him through long years of exile. "Speak plainly, Grey Pilgrim. What opportunity do you offer, and what price does it carry?" From within his robes, Gandalf drew forth the map he had taken from the throne room of Erebor, its ancient parchment crackling as he unfolded it in the light of the forge fire. Thorin's breath caught as he recognized the familiar outlines, the carefully marked passages and chambers that had been home to his people for countless generations. "The map of the Lonely Mountain," he whispered, reaching out to touch the precious document with fingers that trembled slightly. But how? It was lost when Smaug came, burned with all the other treasures of my grandfather's hall. Not burned, Gandalf replied. Hidden, kept safe in places where dragonfire could not reach, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. That day has come, Thorin. The time of your return is at hand. The Dwarf Lord studied the map with growing excitement, tracing the secret paths that he had walked as a child, identifying the hidden doors that even Smaug, in all his years of occupancy, had not discovered. Here was the key to everything he had dreamed of, the means to reclaim his inheritance and restore his people to their rightful home. But the dragon still lives, he said at last, his practical nature reasserting itself over his initial enthusiasm. Smaug the mighty, Smaug the chiefest and greatest of calamities. What force of arms could stand against such a foe? What strategy could overcome a creature that has slept for decades upon a bed of gold and grown strong on the accumulated wealth of my forefathers? Gandalf smiled, and in that expression, Thorin caught a glimpse of depths of planning that stretched far beyond the immediate question of dragon slaying. Sometimes the mightiest fortresses are overcome not by direct assault, but by finding the single weak point that brings down the entire structure. Dragons are proud creatures, Thorin, and pride has ever been the downfall of the mighty. Smaug has grown complacent, in his solitude, secure in his belief that no power in Middle-earth dare challenge his dominion. And you propose to challenge him with what? A handful of exiled dwarves and whatever allies we might gather. Even with the secret ways revealed by this map, we would be walking into the lair of a creature that has destroyed armies. Not armies, the wizard corrected gently. Companies, small groups of warriors who relied on strength of arms and conventional tactics. But what if the approach were different? What if instead of a great host announcing its intentions with horns and banners, a small party were to approach in secret, using stealth and cunning rather than force? Thorin's eyes narrowed as he began to see the shape of what Gandalf proposed. A burglary, he said slowly. You're suggesting that we steal back what is already ours by right, rather than take it by conquest. Precisely. And for such a task, one would need not mighty warriors, but a very different sort of companion. Someone small and quiet, someone skilled in the arts of moving unseen and taking what is not guarded. Someone whom even the keen senses of a dragon might overlook, at least long enough to accomplish the essential task. And where would we find such a person? The dwarves are not renowned for stealth and silence. We prefer the honest clash of axe on shield to skulking in shadows. Gandalf's smile widened. I know of someone who might serve, a person of quality and respectability, yet possessed of certain talents that are not immediately apparent. Someone who values comfort and security, but who might be persuaded to risk both for the right cause and in the right company. As the wizard spoke, he was already seeing how the various threads of his planning would weave together. Bilbo's restless yearning for adventure, carefully nurtured over years of friendship and conversation. Thorin's desperate need to reclaim his inheritance and restore his people's honor. The map that would make it all possible, and the subtle guidance that would keep the venture from becoming mere reckless folly. But beneath these immediate considerations lay deeper purposes. For the reclaiming of Erebor would accomplish far more than the restoration of a single dwarf kingdom. It would re-establish the ancient alliance between the dwarves and the men of Dale, creating a stronghold in the north that could stand against the darkness gathering in the east. It would deny to the enemy a treasure hoard that could finance armies, and a strategic position that could threaten the free peoples from an unexpected direction. Most importantly, it would prove that the great evil was not invulnerable, that its plans could be disrupted by courage and determination applied at precisely the right moment and in precisely the right way. The construction of Minas Morgul might proceed according to the necromancer's design, but the reconstruction of Erebor would serve as a beacon of hope to counter the Tower of Despair. When? Thorin asked, and Gandalf could hear in that single word the weight of years of frustrated longing finally given focus and direction. Soon, the wizard replied. But first, there are preparations to be made, companions to be gathered, and one particular burglar to be recruited. The road to Erebor will not be easy, and success will depend as much upon the hearts of those who walk it as upon the strength of their arms or the sharpness of their blades. Thorin nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the map spread before them. In its ancient lines and careful markings, he could see not just the path to his inheritance, but the first step in a larger journey that would reshape the destinies of all the peoples of Middle-earth. Then let the word go forth, he said firmly. Thorin Oakenshield rides to reclaim the lonely mountain. Let all who would share in glory and danger make ready to join the company of the quest. Outside the forge, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant places and the promise of deeds that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. The plan was set in motion at last, and though none could foresee all the consequences that would flow from this moment, already the great wheels of destiny had begun to turn. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from living rock and filled with the accumulated wealth of ages, something stirred that had lain dormant for decades. Smaug the Mighty opened one great golden eye, then another, as vibrations that had nothing to do with the settling of stone reached his heightened senses through the bedrock itself. The dragon had grown vast during his long occupancy of Erebor, fed not just by the meat he hunted in the desolate lands around the mountain, but by the very gold upon which he slept. For dragons were creatures not merely of fire and scale, but of greed made manifest, and the treasure hoard he guarded had become part of his essential being, each coin and cup and precious stone adding to his power and his terrible beauty. Now, as he lifted his great head from the bed of gold that had cradled him through his long slumber, Smaug felt a disturbance in the patterns of the world that set his nerves ablaze with suspicion and rage. Something was moving in the darkness beyond his domain, something that thought to approach the lonely mountain with stealth and cunning rather than the honest terror that was his due. "Thieves," he rumbled, and the word echoed through the vast halls like thunder rolling down from storm clouds. "Conspirators and would-be burglars, thinking to creep like worms through the secret ways of my mountain. Do they imagine that Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities, sleeps so soundly that their tiny footsteps will not wake him?" The dragon rose from his bed of gold with a sound like an avalanche, his massive coils sending coins cascading in golden waterfalls as he stretched muscles that had been still for far too long. Each scale upon his hide was a work of art in itself, shaped by fire and time into armor that no mortal weapon could penetrate. His eyes burned like furnaces in the darkness, and when he breathed, flames licked around his terrible jaws. Yet for all his power and malice, Smaug was not merely a creature of destruction. Dragons were among the most intelligent of all beings, possessed of cunning that matched their might and memory that stretched back to the earliest days of the world. He knew the history of every treasure in his hoard, could recite the lineage of every golden cup and jeweled sword, understood the deeper currents of politics and war that flowed through Middle-earth like underground rivers. And now, as he extended his senses beyond the confines of his lair, the dragon began to perceive the larger patterns of which the approaching threat was merely a part. There were stirrings in many places, councils of the wise, gatherings of exiled princes, the subtle movements of those who thought themselves too clever to attract his notice. "Gandalf," he hissed, and the name was like poison on his forked tongue. The grey fool meddles again, thinking his small lights and lesser magics can stand against the fire that burns at the heart of the world. But dragons remember, Grey Pilgrim. We remember the elder days, when your kind was younger and more honest in their ambitions. We remember the wars of gods and angels, and we know that all lights fade in time. Moving with surprising grace for one so massive, Smaug began to explore the outer reaches of his domain, following passages that had not felt his presence for years. The mountain was vast, honeycombed with tunnels and chambers that stretched from its roots to its peaks, and over the decades of his occupancy, he had mapped every corridor, sealed every entrance that might provide access to unwelcome visitors. Yet, as he moved through the familiar darkness, the dragon began to sense something that filled him with a rage beyond ordinary anger. There were scents in the air that should not have been there. The smell of dwarf work, of hammers and forges, of plans being laid and preparations being made. Somewhere, in hidden places that even his keen senses could not immediately locate, the descendants of those who had once called this mountain home were stirring again. "Thorin," he whispered, and the word carried with it the weight of old hatred and anticipated pleasure. "Thorin Oakenshield, heir to the throne that I cast down, dreamer of dreams that I have made into nightmares. Do you truly believe that you can return to reclaim what I have made mine by right of conquest? Do you imagine that the years of exile have made you strong enough to face the fire that destroyed your grandsire's kingdom?" But even as he savored the prospect of confronting his ancient enemy, Smaug began to understand that the approaching threat was more complex than mere revenge or simple greed. There was a pattern here, a design that stretched beyond the borders of the lonely mountain to encompass struggles and alliances that spanned all of Middle-earth. In the east, shadows were gathering around a tower that had once been fair but was being transformed into something that would make the very stars weep to look upon it. In the south, the great kingdoms of men were beginning to stir as if from a long sleep, sensing dangers that their wisdom could not yet name. And in the west, in places so humble that they seemed beneath the notice of the great powers, small folk were being drawn into events that would determine the fate of all the world. A game, Smaug realized, his terrible intelligence beginning to grasp the scope of what was unfolding. A great game played across continents and centuries, with kings and wizards and dragons as the pieces. But who moves the pieces, I wonder? Who sits beyond the board and calculates the outcomes of each gambit and sacrifice? The dragon's laughter was like the roar of a furnace, terrible and beautiful in its malice, for he understood now that his role in the coming conflict was not merely that of guardian of treasure or destroyer of armies. He was to be catalyst and crucible both, the fire in which the true metal of heroes would be tested and either proven or consumed. "Let them come then," he said to the listening darkness. "Let the exiled prince and his wizard patron approach with whatever allies they can muster. Let them bring their maps and their hopes, their courage and their clever plans. I am Smaug the Mighty, last of the great fire drakes of the north, and I have been sleeping too long upon my bed of gold. It is time to wake fully, time to stretch my wings and test my flame against the boldness of those who dare to challenge me." As the dragon settled back upon his hoard to wait for the coming confrontation, his dreams were filled with visions of fire and glory, of battles that would be remembered until the ending of the world. Yet beneath the anticipation of combat lay something else, a growing awareness that the outcome of the approaching conflict would echo far beyond the halls of the lonely mountain. For in awakening Smaug, the plotters and planners had set in motion forces that could not be easily controlled or contained. The fire that would test the courage of heroes might also serve to forge weapons that could be turned against the darkness gathering in the east. The dragon's hoard might be reclaimed by its rightful heirs, but the price of that victory would be measured in ways that none of the participants could fully foresee. In the depths of Erebor, golden eyes gazed into darkness, and saw the future burning bright with promise and peril. The fire had awakened, and all the world would feel its heat before the tale was fully told. In the fortress of Barad-dûr, where the very stones were forged from malice, and the towers pierced the sky like black spears thrust upward in defiance of heaven, a presence stirred that had been biding its time through long centuries of apparent defeat. The Dark Lord Sauron, greatest of the Maiar to fall into shadow, lifted his attention from the immediate work of corruption and cast his sight across the wide lands of Middle-earth with growing satisfaction. The transformation of Minas Ithil proceeded exactly as he had designed. His servants moved through the White City like poison through veins, their influence spreading from the foundations upward until even the moon letters carved into the tower's highest stones began to pulse with sickly light. Soon, very soon, the Tower of the Rising Moon would complete its metamorphosis into Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and its baleful radiance would carry his will into every corner of the lands between the mountains of shadow and the sea. But that single victory, masterful though it was, represented only the first movement in a far grander symphony of conquest. For Sauron had learned patience through his defeats, had discovered that lasting victory came not through the crude application of overwhelming force, but through the careful orchestration of apparently unrelated events until they formed a crescendo of inevitability. "The grey wizard stirs," he mused, his voice like silk drawn across steel as he contemplated the intelligence brought by his most trusted servants. "Gandalf the meddlesome gathers his pieces and sets them in motion, thinking to counter my designs with schemes of his own. But does he understand the true scope of the game we play? Does he see how each of his moves serves my greater purpose?" Through the palantir that was his window into the affairs of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord observed the stirrings in both east and west. In the Blue Mountains, an exiled prince gathered his kinsmen and dreamed of reclaiming his ancestral home. In the Shire, a comfortable hobbit felt the first stirrings of discontent with his peaceful existence. And in the ruins of Dol Guldur, the abandoned fortress still whispered with echoes of the plans that had been burned from its walls. "Let the dwarves march to their mountain," Sauron said with terrible satisfaction. "Let them wake the dragon and test their courage against his fire. For in that testing, they will forge themselves into the very tools I need for the greater work that lies ahead. Thorin Oakenshield seeks to reclaim his crown, but crowns can be bent to serve new masters if the pressure is applied with sufficient skill." The Dark Lord rose from his throne and moved to the great window that looked eastward toward the lands where his most faithful servants labored in secret. There, in the breeding pits beneath the misty mountains, new armies were taking shape. Not the crude orcs of the elder days, but creatures bred for specific purposes, each designed to fulfill a particular role in the campaigns to come. "The free peoples have grown soft in their prosperity," he continued, speaking to shadows that listened with the attention of devoted students. "They believe that the great conflicts are behind them, that the age of heroes has passed into legend. They do not understand that I have been using their very peace against them, allowing them to forget the disciplines of war while I prepared weapons they cannot imagine. Chief among these weapons were the Nine, the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths who had once been kings of men, but who now served as his most terrible lieutenants. Through the long years of apparent defeat, they had walked among the peoples of Middle-earth in forms that aroused no suspicion, gathering intelligence, sowing discord, preparing the groundwork for the campaigns that would reduce the proudest cities to ash and ruin. But the greatest weapon remains unfinished, Sauron admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper that nonetheless seemed to echo through every stone of his fortress. The ruling ring, the master of all the rings of power, lies hidden still in places where even my sight cannot penetrate. Without it, my victory remains incomplete. my dominion subject to challenge by those who possess the other rings of the elves. Yet even this seemingly insurmountable obstacle might be turned to his advantage, given sufficient patience and cunning. For the ring had a will of its own, a desire to return to its master that grew stronger with each passing year. And if the conflicts he was orchestrating proceeded according to plan, if the various peoples of Middle-earth could be maneuvered into positions where desperation overcame wisdom, then someone among them might be driven to seek out weapons of power, no matter what the cost. "The dragon stirs," one of his shadows reported, its voice like the whisper of wind through bones. Smaug the Mighty prepares for war, his fires burning bright with anticipation of battle. The approach of the dwarf company has awakened not just his greed, but his pride. He will not be content merely to defend his horde. He will seek to demonstrate his supremacy over all who dare to challenge him. Sauron smiled, an expression that would have frozen the blood of any mortal who witnessed it. Excellent. Pride has ever been the weakness of dragons, and pride properly directed can serve purposes its possessor never intended. Let Smaug rage and burn. Let him spread fire and desolation across the lands of the north. For in doing so, he will drive men and elves and dwarves into alliances they would never have considered in peacetime. Alliances that will make them vulnerable to influences they do not suspect. The Dark Lord turned his attention back to the Palantir, focusing his will upon the ancient seeing stone until its depths revealed visions of possible futures. In some, he saw his enemies triumphant, their cities rebuilt, and their peoples prosperous under the protection of kings who wielded the light against the darkness. But in others, in the futures that grew more probable with each passing day, he saw a different outcome entirely. "The blade is forged," he murmured, watching as the images shifted and changed in response to his will. "The edge is honed, the balance perfected, but it has not yet been drawn from its sheath, has not yet tasted the blood for which it thirsts. Soon though, very soon now, the weapon I have spent ages creating will be revealed in all its terrible glory." That weapon was not made of steel or iron, but of corruption itself. The slow, systematic perversion of everything the free peoples held dear until their very virtues became the means of their destruction. Honor would compel them to fight battles they could not win. Love would drive them to make sacrifices that served his purposes. Hope would blind them to the true nature of the forces they opposed until it was too late for resistance. "And when that blade is finally drawn," Sauron concluded, his voice rising like the roar of a furnace, "it will cut through their defenses as easily as fire burns through parchment. The age of the free peoples will end, and the dominion of the shadow will begin, not with the crude violence of conquest, but with the elegant certainty of a tide that drowns the land and leaves only darkness in its wake." In the depths of Barad-dûr, the Nazgûl stirred in response to their master's words, their ancient forms taking on substance as they prepared for the roles they would play in the campaigns to come. Above them, the eye that was Sauron's will, made manifest, turned its gaze toward the west, where small folk went about their daily lives in ignorance of the storm that was gathering. The blade was indeed forged and ready. Soon it would be time to draw it forth and test its edge against the courage of those who still believed that light could triumph over darkness. The outcome, the Dark Lord knew, was all but certain, for he had been preparing for this moment far longer than his enemies had been preparing to resist it. In the growing shadow, something that might have been laughter echoed through the halls of the Dark Tower, terrible and beautiful in its certainty of ultimate victory. The great gates of Erebor stood open for the first time in decades, their massive stone doors thrown wide to welcome the dawn that broke like gold across the peaks of the lonely mountain. Within the ancient halls, the sound of hammers rang out in rhythms that had been silent since the coming of the dragon. as the dwarves of Thorin's company worked to cleanse and restore their ancestral home. Gandalf stood upon the ramparts that crowned the mountain's highest peak, his grey robe stirring in the wind that brought the sense of victory and renewal from the valleys below. Behind him, the halls that had once echoed with Smaug's terrible presence now hummed with the industrious activity of a people reclaiming their birthright. Before him, the lands that had lain desolate under the dragon's shadow showed the first green, signs of life returning. "It is accomplished," said Thorin, joining the wizard upon the wind-swept stones. The king under the mountain bore himself with new dignity now that his crown had been reclaimed. Yet there was weariness in his eyes that spoke of victories bought at prices higher than anyone had anticipated. "The dragon is slain, the treasure secured, the kingdom restored to its rightful heirs. You should be well pleased with the success of your design, Grey Pilgrim." But Gandalf's expression remained troubled as he gazed eastward toward shadows that gathered beyond the horizon, like storm clouds building for a tempest. "One victory does not win a war, my dear Thorin. Indeed, sometimes success in a single battle serves only to reveal the true scope of the conflict that lies ahead. Smaug's death has sent ripples throughout Middle-earth, and not all who felt them are pleased by the news of his passing." The wizard's words proved prophetic even as he spoke them. From the north came tidings brought by ravens that the armies of the orcs were stirring in their mountain fastnesses, driven by orders from masters whose names were whispered only in darkness. From the east came rumors of shadows moving upon the borders of Mirkwood, of spiders grown large and bold, of a darkness that pressed against the very borders of the woodland realm. "Let them come," Thorin declared, his hand falling instinctively to the hilt of his sword. "The dwarves of Erebor have faced greater perils than mountain orcs and wood spiders. Our gates are strong, our weapons keen, our resolve unshakable. Any force that dares to challenge us will find the cost of such presumption far higher than they can afford to pay." Yet even as the dwarf king spoke these bold words, both he and Gandalf knew that the true test of their victory lay not in their ability to withstand siege, but in their capacity to forge the alliances that would be necessary for the greater conflicts ahead. For the reclaiming of Erebor had implications that stretched far beyond the borders of the Lonely Mountain, implications that would reshape the balance of power throughout the northern regions of Middle-earth. Already the effects were becoming apparent. In Dale, the city that had been built in the shadow of the mountain's protection, men were returning to streets that had lain empty since the dragon's coming. Bard the bowman, whose arrow had found the one weak spot in Smaug's armored hide, was acclaimed as a leader worthy to restore the ancient kingdom of his forefathers. And from Laketown came envoys bearing offers of trade and alliance that would bind the peoples of the Long Lake to the fortunes of the restored kingdom. "The old alliances are stirring," Gandalf observed with satisfaction. "Men and dwarves standing together as they did in the elder days, when the forces of darkness first sought to claim dominion over Middle-earth. But we must move carefully now, for our enemies have learned cunning through their defeats, and they will not allow such alliances to form without challenge." Even as he spoke, scouts brought word of movements in the misty mountains that confirmed his warnings. Great armies were indeed marching, not the rabble of common orcs, but disciplined hosts led by captains who bore the marks of a more terrible master than any mountain chieftain. These were the forces of Dol Guldur itself, sent forth to test the strength of the newly restored kingdom and to probe for weaknesses that might be exploited in larger campaigns to come. "The battle of 5 armies," Thorin murmured, recognizing the shape of the conflict that was approaching. Men and elves and dwarves standing together against the darkness, as was foretold in the ancient prophecies. But 3 against 2. Will our strength be sufficient for the trial that awaits? Gandalf's smile held depths of knowledge that the Dwarf King could not fully fathom. "Numbers alone do not determine the outcome of such conflicts, my friend. Sometimes a single act of courage, a moment of sacrifice freely chosen, can tip the balance in ways that no amount of military calculation can predict. And sometimes the most unlikely individuals prove to be the ones upon whom the fate of nations turns. As if summoned by his words, Bilbo Baggins appeared upon the ramparts, his small form dwarfed by the grandeur of the mountain kingdom he had helped to reclaim. The hobbit bore little resemblance to the comfortable burglar who had first answered Thorin's call for adventure. The trials of the road had left their mark upon him, tempering his natural timidity into a quiet courage that had surprised even those who knew him best. The armies approached from 3 directions, Bilbo reported with the precision of one who had learned to observe carefully and report accurately. But there is something else, something that troubles me more than mere numbers. The darkness that leads them is not merely the absence of light. It is darkness given substance and will. Darkness that seeks not just victory, but the corruption of everything it touches. Gandalf nodded gravely, for the hobbit had seen clearly what many of the great and wise had failed to perceive. Indeed, Master Baggins, this battle will be fought not just with sword and spear, but with the very essence of what we choose to defend. The enemy seeks not merely to defeat us, but to turn our own virtues against us, to make our courage serve despair, our hope breed futility. The preparations continued through the night, as the various allies gathered their forces and made ready for the conflict that would test everything they had worked to achieve. The men of Dale mustered under Bard's banner, their faces grim with the knowledge that they fought not just for their restored city, but for the right of all free peoples to live without fear. The elves of the woodland realm arrived with the first light of dawn, their armor gleaming silver and their weapons singing with the deadly music of their ancient craftsmanship. And from the halls of Erebor came the dwarves, their axes bright with new forged steel, and their shields bearing the emblems of clans that had waited generations for this moment of vindication. Yet even as they marched to war, each warrior carried within his heart the knowledge that they fought not just for treasure or territory, but for the preservation of something far more precious, the right to forge their own destiny in the fires of their choosing. The battle, when it came, raged across the slopes of the lonely mountain with a fury that shook the very foundations of the earth. Orc and warg, goblin and fell beast crashed against the ordered ranks of the Alliance like waves against a seawall, seeking to overwhelm courage with mere numbers, hope with the weight of despair made manifest. Yet for all the heroism displayed, for all the blood spilled upon the stones that had once known only the dragon's fire, the true victory of that day lay not in the clash of armies, but in smaller acts of grace. When Thorin fell beneath the weapons of his enemies, his last words were not of vengeance or regret, but of reconciliation and peace. When the tide of battle seemed darkest, it was Bilbo's quiet courage, the courage of one who fought not from hatred of his enemies, but from love of his friends, that inspired others to deeds they had not known they possessed the strength to perform. And when the darkness finally broke and fled before the renewed light of dawn, what remained was not the mere absence of evil, but the presence of something greater, the knowledge that free peoples, when they stood together in common cause, could not be defeated by any force that sought to bend them to its will. "The kingdom is reclaimed indeed," Gandalf said as he surveyed the field where the shadows had been driven back. "But more than that, the example is set. Others will see what was accomplished here, and they will remember that even the mightiest darkness can be overcome when courage takes its stand upon the soil of home." In the deepest pool of the misty mountains, where the roots of stone reached down toward the very heart of the world, something glittered in the darkness with a light that was not light. A circle of gold that held within its simple form powers beyond the comprehension of most who walked beneath the sun and stars. The One Ring lay hidden in the depths of Gollum's cave, forgotten by all save the wretched creature who had possessed it for centuries, yet its influence spread like ripples in still water, touching destinies and shaping fates in ways that none could foresee. The ring had been sleeping, after its fashion, content to remain hidden while the great events of the world unfolded without its direct influence. But sleep for such an artifact was not the simple rest of mortal beings. It was a state of watchful waiting, of gathering power and purpose, of preparing for the moment when its true nature would be revealed and its ultimate destiny fulfilled. Now, as the echoes of battle faded from the halls of Erebor and the news of Smaug's death spread throughout Middle-earth, the ring stirred with something that might have been satisfaction. For events were taking shape that would serve its purposes well, creating the chaos and conflict that would drive those who sought power to increasingly desperate measures. In the depths of Barad-dûr, Sauron felt that stirring like a distant echo of his own will, a resonance that spoke of opportunities approaching faster than even his careful plans had anticipated. The victory at Erebor had indeed served his purposes, but not in the ways that the victors imagined. For in reclaiming their mountain kingdom, the dwarves had also removed one of the few barriers that stood between the forces of darkness and the rich lands of the west. "The dragon is dead," he mused, his voice carrying satisfaction that his servants recognized as more dangerous than any rage. "The great treasure hoard lies open to those bold enough to claim it, and the mountain itself stands vulnerable to siege from enemies who approach not with honest war horns, but with corruption that seeps through stone itself. The dwarves believe they have won a great victory, but they have merely created the conditions for their own eventual downfall. Yet even the Dark Lord did not fully comprehend the deeper currents that his own schemes had set in motion. For the ring was not merely a tool of his will, despite being forged by his own hand in the fires of Mount Doom. It possessed an intelligence of its own, a cunning that sometimes served purposes that even its maker had not fully intended. Deep in the goblin tunnels beneath the misty mountains, Bilbo Baggins had found something during his desperate flight from capture, a simple gold band that had seemed unremarkable, save for the way it made him invisible to his pursuers. The hobbit had slipped the ring onto his finger without understanding what he held, had used its power to escape from Gollum's realm and rejoin his companions, had carried it all unknowing through the adventures that followed. Now, as he stood upon the restored battlements of Erebor and gazed westward toward the green hills of home, Bilbo felt the weight of that simple circle in his pocket, like a tangible presence. He had told no one of his discovery. Some instinct he could not name had warned him that such knowledge was too dangerous to share lightly. The ring seemed so innocent, so unremarkable, yet sometimes when he held it, he felt as though he were holding the concentrated essence of power itself. "A curious thing," he murmured to himself as he walked the ramparts in the gathering dusk. Gollum called it his precious, and spoke of it as though it were the most important thing in all the world. Yet what can it be but a simple magic ring, one of many such trinkets left over from the elder days? Surely, if it were truly significant, wise folk like Gandalf would know of its existence. But Gandalf himself was troubled by thoughts he could not quite bring into focus, memories that stirred at the edges of consciousness like half-remembered dreams. There had been something in the hobbit's tale of his escape from the goblin tunnels, some detail that nagged at the wizard's mind with persistent unease. A riddle game played in darkness, a creature who spoke of loss and theft, a ring that granted invisibility to its wearer. These elements combined in patterns that awakened echoes of ancient lore. 9 for mortal men doomed to die, he recited softly as he stood alone in his chambers, the words of the ancient rhyme taking on new significance in light of recent events. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 3 for the elven kings under the sky, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. the one ring to rule them all. Could it be possible that the simple band Bilbo had found was that very artifact, the ruling ring that Sauron had forged in the fires of Mount Doom and lost when his physical form was destroyed at the end of the Second Age? The implications were staggering, too vast and terrible to contemplate without careful thought and deeper research. Yet even as Gandalf wrestled with these possibilities, the ring itself continued its subtle work of influence and corruption. Not the crude domination that the lesser rings imposed upon their bearers, but something far more insidious: the gradual erosion of moral certainties, the slow expansion of what seemed permissible in pursuit of worthy goals. Bilbo found himself making small compromises that would have appalled his younger self. A lie here, a deception there, a growing willingness to use the ring's power not just for escape from danger, but for convenience, for advantage, for the simple pleasure of having a secret that set him apart from his companions. Each use seemed innocent enough in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that would have alarmed anyone wise enough to recognize it. "My precious," he whispered one night as he held the ring up to catch the moonlight, unconsciously echoing the words of the creature from whom he had won it. The endearment seemed natural, appropriate. After all, what harm could there be in treasuring something so useful and so uniquely his own? But the ring's influence extended far beyond its immediate bearer. Like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water, its presence affected the very fabric of fate itself, drawing together the threads of destiny in patterns that served purposes greater and more terrible than any single mind could encompass. In Rivendell, Elrond felt a shadow pass across his spirit as he studied the ancient texts, a premonition of sorrows yet to come that made his heart heavy with foreknowledge. In Lothlorien, Galadriel gazed into her mirror and saw visions of fire and darkness that spoke of trials approaching swifter than the turning of seasons. And in the depths of Moria, where the Balrog slept beneath stone and flame, something stirred in response to the growing resonance of power that echoed through the deep places of the world. "The ring stirs," whispered voices in the darkness, ancient beyond reckoning, yet young compared to the artifact they discussed. "The master calls, and the servant answers. Soon now, very soon, the long sleep will end and the true work will begin." For the ring had purposes that transcended the ambitions of any single Dark Lord, drives and desires that had been woven into its very substance during the moment of its forging. It sought not merely to return to its maker, but to fulfill the destiny for which it had been created, to be the instrument through which all the scattered powers of Middle-earth would be gathered into a single will, a single purpose, a single darkness that would endure until the ending of the world. In his comfortable study at Bag End, far from the great events that shaped the fate of nations, Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire and turned a simple gold ring over and over in his hands. The hobbit hummed quietly to himself as he contemplated the adventures that lay behind him and the peaceful years that surely lay ahead, never suspecting that he held in his palm the key to powers that could reshape the very foundations of existence. Outside his window, the stars wheeled in their courses as they had since the making of the world, yet even they seemed to burn with a different light, colder, more distant, as though they too sensed that the age of innocence was drawing to its close, and the time of trial was at hand. The ring still slept, but its dreams were growing darker, and when it finally woke, all of Middle-earth would tremble at the power of its awakening. The towers of Dol Guldur stood empty against the dawn sky, their black stones cold and lifeless as the fortress that had been the heart of so much malice fell silent for the first time in centuries. The White Council had come at last in all their power. Gandalf and Saruman, Elrond and Galadriel, accompanied by such a host of the wise and mighty as had not been seen gathered together since the elder days. Yet as they walked through the abandoned halls, where shadow had made its dwelling, there was little triumph in their victory. For the necromancer had not been destroyed, or even truly defeated. He had simply withdrawn, taking with him all the accumulated malice and careful planning that had made this place a wound in the very fabric of Middle-earth. He knew, Gandalf said quietly as he stood in the chamber where he had once confronted the voice of corruption itself. Long before we marshaled our forces for this assault, he knew we were coming. The withdrawal was not a retreat, but a strategic redeployment. The next move in a game whose true scope we are only beginning to understand. Galadriel moved through the ruined halls like a figure from a dream, her presence bringing light to places that had known only darkness for too long. Yet even her radiance could not entirely cleanse the corruption that had seeped into the very stones, could not undo the spiritual architecture that had made this fortress a gateway for malice to enter the world. "The plans are gone," she observed, studying the walls where once the diagrams of corruption had been carved in living stone. "But the knowledge they contained has not been destroyed, merely transferred to minds that will guard it carefully until the time comes for its implementation. The construction of Minas Morgul will proceed, perhaps even more swiftly, now that the architect no longer needs to work in secret." Saruman the White stood at the great window that looked eastward toward the distant shadows of Mordor, his staff planted firmly upon the stone floor as he contemplated the implications of what they had discovered. "A fortress abandoned is not a fortress destroyed," he said, his voice carrying undertones of frustration that bordered on anger. "We have accomplished nothing here save to alert our enemy to the extent of our knowledge and the limits of our power." But Elrond, eldest among them in wisdom, if not in years, shook his head slowly as he studied the patterns of evacuation that told their own story to those with eyes to see. "Not nothing, Curanir. We have learned something of great value, that our enemy fears us enough to avoid direct confrontation, that he believes his plans are not yet mature enough to withstand the full opposition of the wise. There is hope in that knowledge, if we have the wisdom to use it well." As they explored the depths of the fortress, the members of the council began to piece together the true scope of what they opposed. For Dol Guldur had been more than a simple stronghold. It had been a center of learning, a place where the ancient arts of corruption and transformation had been studied and refined with scholarly precision. The libraries were empty now, their shelves stripped of all save the most innocuous texts, but enough remained to show what had been housed here. Treatises on the bending of light and shadow, architectural studies of how beauty could be perverted while maintaining its essential form, philosophical investigations into the nature of hope and despair, all the intellectual apparatus necessary to wage war, not just on bodies and cities, but on the very concepts that gave meaning to existence. "A university of evil," Gandalf murmured as he examined the remains of a laboratory where experiments in spiritual corruption had been conducted with scientific rigor. Not the crude malice of orcs or the bestial hunger of dragons, but malice refined and systematized, given theoretical foundation and practical application. This is what we face. Not mere darkness, but darkness made intelligent and purposeful. In the deepest chambers of the fortress, they found evidence of connections that stretched far beyond the borders of Mirkwood. Maps marked with symbols in the Black Speech, correspondence conducted in ciphers that spoke of a network of agents and allies spanning all of Middle-earth, carefully maintained genealogies that traced bloodlines and political connections with the thoroughness of master strategists. "He has been preparing for war," Galadriel said as she studied these documents with growing alarm. Not the swift conquest that marked his earlier attempts at dominion, but a slow campaign of corruption and subversion that could continue for centuries if necessary. "Every kingdom has been studied, every weakness catalogued, every potential point of leverage identified and prepared for exploitation. Yet even as they catalogued the scope of their enemies' preparations, the members of the council began to understand that the evacuation of Dol Guldur represented something more than mere tactical withdrawal. For in abandoning this fortress, the necromancer had also revealed the next phase of his grand design, the consolidation of power in strongholds that could not be easily assaulted, the gathering of forces for conflicts that would be fought on grounds of his choosing. Barad-dûr, Saruman said, speaking the name like a curse. The Dark Tower rises again in Mordor, its stones cemented with malice and its foundations rooted in the very fires of the earth. There he will make his final stand, protected by such barriers of flame and shadow as no mortal army could hope to overcome. But Gandalf's attention had been caught by something else, a detail in the abandoned documents that sent chills through his aged bones. Among the many plans and preparations, among the careful studies of fortification and corruption, he had found references to a search, a systematic effort to locate something that had been lost, something whose recovery would complete the Dark Lord's return to his full power. "The ring," he whispered, and the words seemed to echo through the empty chambers like a prophecy of doom. "He seeks the ruling ring, the master of all the rings of power. If he should find it, if he should reclaim the weapon he forged in the fires of Mount Doom, then all our efforts, all our victories, will count for nothing." The implications settled upon the council like a weight of lead, for they all knew the lore of the rings, understood the balance of power that had held the Dark Lord in check since his defeat at the end of the Second Age. As long as the One Ring remained lost, as long as its power could not be united with the will of its maker, Sauron's dominion remained incomplete, his victory uncertain. But if the ring should be found, if it should be reclaimed by the hand that forged it, then the three rings of the elves would be revealed and dominated, their bearers reduced to slaves of a will that brooked no opposition. The age of the free peoples would end not with the clash of armies, but with the simple act of slipping a circle of gold onto a finger of darkness. "We must search," Elrond said urgently. "Every path must be explored, every rumor investigated, every possibility pursued. If the ring still exists somewhere in Middle-earth, we must find it before our enemy does, and we must ensure that it is placed beyond his reach, no matter what the cost." Yet even as they made their plans and prepared to depart the ruins of Dol Guldur, none of the wise suspected how close to fulfillment the Dark Lord's search had already come. For in a comfortable hobbit hole in the Shire, surrounded by books and maps and the simple comforts of home, Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire and turned a simple gold ring over and over in his hands, never dreaming that he held the fate of Middle-earth in his palm. The necromancer had withdrawn, but he had not retreated. He had simply moved the game to new grounds, where the stakes would be higher and the consequences of failure more terrible than any who opposed him could fully comprehend. The construction of Minas Morgul would continue, the gathering of armies would proceed, and somewhere in the darkness, patient and implacable, the search for the ring would go on. But for now, for this brief moment, between one catastrophe and the next, there was peace in the halls of Dol Guldur. The shadows had been driven back, the immediate threat contained, and those who served the light could take comfort in the knowledge that evil had been forced to show its hand before it was fully ready. It was a victory of sorts, though they would not know its true cost until the final accounting had been made and the last pages of the tale had been written in fire and blood upon the stones of a world transformed. The evening light fell soft and golden across the lands of the Shire, painting the rolling hills in shades of amber and rose as another day drew to its peaceful close. In the gardens of Bag End, the flowers that Bilbo had planted with such care bloomed in ordered profusion, their colours bright against the green grass that surrounded his comfortable home like a living carpet. Gandalf stood at the garden gate, his grey robe stirring gently in the evening breeze as he contemplated the scene before him. Here, in this haven of simplicity and contentment, it seemed impossible to believe that darkness gathered in distant places, that great powers stirred with malice aforethought, that the very foundations of the world trembled beneath the weight of approaching conflict. Yet even as he watched, the wizard's keen eyes noted details that spoke of changes deeper than the turning of seasons. Bilbo moved through his garden with a restlessness that had not been there before his adventures, pausing often to gaze eastward toward the horizon, as though listening for sounds that carried on winds from far away. The hobbit's face had gained lines that spoke of experiences no amount of comfortable living could erase, and his eyes held depths that would have surprised those neighbors who still thought of him as merely an eccentric stay-at-home. "You feel it too," Gandalf said softly as Bilbo approached the gate, a watering can in his hands and mud on his boots from his evening's work among the flower beds. The stirring of great events, the sense that the world stands balanced on the edge of changes that will reshape everything we have known. Bilbo set down his watering can and leaned against the gatepost, his weathered hands folding over the smooth wood as he considered the wizard's words. "Something is different," he agreed quietly. "The very air tastes of it. Not danger exactly, but possibility. As though all the comfortable certainties I once took for granted have become merely temporary arrangements, subject to change without notice." They stood in companionable silence for a while, two friends who had shared dangers and marvels beyond the understanding of most who dwelt beneath the stars. Around them, the Shire continued its ancient rhythms, farmers bringing in their harvests, children playing in the lanes, families gathering around their dinner tables to share the simple blessings of home and hearth. "Do you think it will endure?" Bilbo asked suddenly, his voice carrying a weight of concern that encompassed more than just his own small corner of the world. All of this, the peace, the contentment, the right of simple folk to live simple lives without interference from the great powers of the world. "Sometimes I lie awake at night and wonder if we are living in the last days of something precious, something that can never be recovered once it is lost." Gandalf turned to study his friend's face, seeing there the wisdom that came not from books or scholarship, but from the hard-won experience of one who had looked into the abyss and chosen to turn back toward the light. "Nothing endures forever, my dear Bilbo," he said gently. "Not kingdoms or ages, not peace or war, not even the mountains themselves. But that does not mean such things lack value. Indeed, their very transience may be what makes them most precious." He gestured toward the lights that were beginning to appear in the windows of hobbit holes scattered across the hillsides, each one representing a family gathering for their evening meal, a hearth where love dwelt and simple joys were shared. What we preserve is not the specific form these blessings take, but the possibility that such blessings can exist at all. That somewhere in the world, there will always be places where children can play without fear, where neighbors can gather in friendship, where the greatest concerns are the weather and the crops, and whether there will be enough seed cake for everyone who comes to tea. Bilbo nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes like sunrise breaking over familiar hills. "Hope," he said softly. "We preserve hope, not for ourselves alone, but for those who will come after us, who will build new homes and plant new gardens and find their own ways to kindle light in whatever darkness they may face." "Exactly so, and that hope is not fragile, my friend, despite appearances to the contrary. It has roots that reach deeper than the foundations of mountains, sources that spring from wells that no earthly power can poison or drain dry. For hope is not based on circumstances, but on choices. The choice to believe that goodness matters, that love is stronger than hate, that light can triumph over darkness no matter how deep that darkness may seem." As if summoned by their words, other figures began to appear along the paths that wound through the Shire. Neighbors returning from their day's work, friends walking together in the gathering dusk, young couples strolling hand in hand beneath the first stars. Each carried with them the accumulated wisdom of generations who had chosen to build rather than destroy, to plant rather than uproot, to nurture life rather than spread death. "They don't know," Bilbo observed, watching his neighbors with a mixture of affection and protective concern. "They don't understand that their peaceful existence depends upon the vigilance of guardians they will never meet, upon battles fought in places they cannot pronounce. Sometimes I wonder if that ignorance is a blessing or a curse." "Perhaps it is both," Gandalf replied thoughtfully. "Ignorance of danger can lead to complacency, to a failure to appreciate what one possesses until it is lost. But ignorance can also preserve innocence, can maintain the purity of heart that makes something worth defending in the first place. Not everyone can carry the burden of knowing how precarious our blessings truly are, and perhaps not everyone should." The wizard's gaze drifted eastward, toward lands where shadows gathered and great powers prepared for conflicts that would determine the fate of all who dwelt in Middle-earth. In his mind's eye, he could see the slow construction of Minas Morgul, proceeding according to ancient plans, could sense the patient malice that worked day and night to turn beauty into horror and hope into despair. But here, in this garden where a hobbit tended his flowers with careful love, Gandalf found himself remembering why such battles were worth fighting. Not for glory or power, not for the satisfaction of defeating enemies or the pride of victory, but for the simple right of ordinary folk to live ordinary lives filled with small joys and quiet contentments. "The great wheel turns," he said at last, his voice carrying harmonics of prophecy that made Bilbo glance at him with sharp attention. "Dark times are coming, my friend, times that will test every choice we have made and every value we hold dear. But remember this: no matter how dark the night becomes, dawn always follows. No matter how deep the winter, spring returns to wake the sleeping earth. And no matter how complete the victory of darkness may seem, there will always be those who kindle small lights and refuse to let them be extinguished." Bilbo reached into his pocket and drew forth a simple gold ring, turning it over in his hands, as he had done countless times since winning it in the goblin tunnels beneath the misty mountains. In the gathering dusk, it seemed to gleam with its own inner light, though whether that radiance was real or merely a trick of starlight on polished metal, he could not say. "Sometimes I think this little thing is more important than it appears," he said quietly, not quite able to explain why the ring seemed to grow heavier in his palm with each passing day, as though it were waiting for something, listening for some signal that would wake it from whatever sleep holds it bound. Gandalf felt a chill pass through his spirit at those words, premonition of significance that he could not yet fully comprehend. There was something about that ring, something that tugged at the edges of memory and whispered of powers beyond mortal understanding. But the knowledge remained frustratingly elusive, dancing just beyond the reach of conscious thought, like a name forgotten on the tip of the tongue. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "it would be wise to keep such things close and speak of them sparingly. There are ears in the darkness that listen for whispers of power, eyes that search for glimmers of significance in the most unlikely places. Some secrets are too dangerous to share until the time comes when sharing them can no longer be avoided." As the last light faded from the western sky and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns, the two friends parted ways, Bilbo to his comfortable study, where books and maps awaited his attention, Gandalf to the long roads that would carry him toward whatever destiny awaited in the gathering storm of years to come. But before he passed beyond the borders of the Shire, the wizard paused to look back at the lights that dotted the hillsides like earthbound stars, each one representing a family safe in their home, a hearth where love dwelt and simple blessings were shared in gratitude and joy. Hold fast, he whispered to the night wind that carried his words across the sleeping lands. Hold fast to what you are, to what you have built, to what you choose to defend. For in the trials ahead, it will not be the great and mighty who determine the outcome of the tale, but the small and humble who refuse to let their lights be extinguished. And in the depths of his comfortable hobbit hole, Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire and read from books of ancient lore, unconsciously turning a simple gold ring over and over in his hands, while outside his window the stars wheeled in their courses, and the great story of Middle-earth moved inexorably toward its climax in fire and darkness and hope reborn from ashes. The construction of Minas Morgul continued in distant lands, but here in the Shire, other constructions proceeded as well. The building of friendships and families, the cultivation of gardens and traditions, the patient nurturing of all the small, precious things that made life worth living and defending. In the end, perhaps that was victory enough, to ensure that somewhere in the wide world, there would always be places where hope could take root and grow, where love could flourish despite the darkness, where the choice for light over shadow would be made again and again by those who understood that such choices were the foundation upon which all other victories must be built. The wheel turned, the seasons changed, and in the heart of the Shire, a simple hobbit tended his garden and treasured his books, and kept safe a ring of gold that would one day shake the foundations of the world. But that day had not yet come, and until it did, there was peace beneath the stars, and hope in the simple act of planting seeds that would bloom in gardens not yet imagined, tended by hands not yet born, in a world that would be shaped by choices not yet made. Hope in ashes, light in darkness, and the promise that no matter how the great tale ended, it would be worth the telling. Thus concludes the construction of Minas Morgul, a tale of shadows gathering and light enduring, of great powers stirring and small folk standing firm, of evil building its monuments to despair, while good plants gardens that will bloom long after the monuments have crumbled to dust.